And I think we should put a proven winner in charge.
If I'm elected and I'm coming for you and gun manufacturers, I'm going to take you on.
You're trying to say that I'm
People
dumb.
want a chance to hear women have an opportunity to speak.
If I'm president of the United States, you're not going to interfere in any more.
What a wonderful country we have. The best-known socialist in the country happens to be a millionaire with 3 houses.
And here's the deal. We ought to start rewarding work, not just wealth.
And good evening. Welcome to the Pulse of the Nation. California Decides, a special live stream by the LA Times. I'm
The South from Alabama, Arkansas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Tennessee, but also some states that were homes to his previous competitors or current competitors: Minnesota, home of Amy Klobuchar, and Massachusetts, home of Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders, now his chief competition, it appears, for the Democratic nomination, has collected 3 states. They are Vermont, his home, Utah, and Colorado. There are still 2 states that are too close to call that we're watching. One is the small state of Maine, where Biden currently holds the lead, and another is the very, very large state of Texas, the second biggest state voting today after California, where Bernie Sanders currently holds a narrow lead with only 30% of the vote or precincts counted. So we'll keep an eye on that one, which is very important as the night continues. But now voting has stopped in California, where effectively 58 different elections have been held, one in each county across our state, the largest here in LA, all the way up to the northern border. And county officials everywhere are tallying the ballots and will very soon ready and release the first big dump of votes, which will be from the millions of people who took advantage of the ability to vote before Election Day, visiting the many new vote centers opening up across our county and state to cast their ballots ahead of time. Don't be surprised if you see some votes come in for some candidates who've dropped out in recent days, like former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who were able to receive votes in that earlier period. So in the next 30 to 60 minutes, we expect that big dump of results to come in, followed by some incremental things through the night as we see who will come out ahead here in California, where 415 delegates are at stake, the largest of the entire primary season.
Ben, we're going to come back to you. We're going to keep checking with you. Thanks very much for the initial update here. I want to welcome into the table a group of reporters and editors who have been following the presidential primary very closely for the LA Times and from different vantage points as well. David Lauder is the LA Times bureau chief, and he's also my boss back in Washington. That's him in the middle of the table. Also with us, John Myers, our Sacramento bureau chief, and Tyrone Beeson, a reporter who's been covering the Democratic primary for us. David, you and I talk about this stuff all the time. A lot of these races were called early for Joe Biden tonight, almost as soon as the polls closed, telling you that the margins he's running up are pretty large, especially in some of these southern states. We've talked for a long time about, is Biden real or not as a Democratic frontrunner? And it's been a long time developing, but boy, these dominoes seem to be falling quickly these last few days for him.
Yeah, he sure is real tonight. This was a race that he seemed dead just a few days ago. Came back in South Carolina, won a big victory there, and tonight it's, as you said, it's a steamroll. Bernie Sanders thought that this was the night in which he was going to lock up the race. Instead, Biden has found the key.
How did he do it? Was it just sort of a perfect storm? I mean, the theory all along was just wait till South Carolina, just wait till Super Tuesday. He endured a lot of bad press. But that theory, the campaign's theory of the case, it seems to be playing out pretty well for them.
Well, you know, Biden and his aides said all along, wait until you get to states that are more diverse than New Hampshire, Iowa, places where there's a significant African-American community. They predicted that they were going to do well, and they have. They got about 6 out of 10 of African-American votes tonight. That made a big difference in Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama. But it's not just that. He also won among older voters, and he did quite well in suburban areas among moderate white voters. The one piece of the pie that Sanders has continued to be able to dominate are younger voters, and to some extent Latinos, which is a big factor here in California and also in states like Texas and Colorado. But you got to say, at this point, this night belonged to Biden.
Yeah, I mean, Tyrone, you were in South Carolina over the weekend you had a great piece about black voters, and they want to beat Trump really badly, but they looked at the field and they weren't sure, at least it seemed this way prior to the South Carolina primary, they weren't sure that anybody in there would be up to it. Do you think that they've sent a message now by propelling Biden to such a large victory in South Carolina that look, the black voters, who are a big piece of the Democratic electorate, have picked their horse?
Absolutely. I think it's true that voters who are African American in South Carolina are very worried about the state of the race. They want to get rid of Donald Trump. They weren't quite sure that the party itself had a plan to do that. But I don't think there was any doubt in the minds of the people I interviewed about Biden being the one to do that. It's just a matter of can he articulate that? Can he make that kind of final push for them? But they were in his corner. I talked to someone there actually at a restaurant before I left Charleston to head to Columbia for Biden's victory or concession speech. And you know, the person basically said to me that we knew all along. You know, we were pretty confident that he was going to take South Carolina. But the idea in their minds is, does the party surrounding him have a way to make sure that he becomes the next president? Right. So it's two different things going on there.
Right, and for all the headlines, John, about Joe Biden, this being Joe Biden's night, he is stacking up wins. Ultimately, this is a delegate fight here. Yeah. And California, I mean, you know, there are 150-something delegates that have been allotted over the first 4 contests. California has 3 times that many just tonight. And Bernie Sanders seems to be, I mean, we haven't really gotten to much of the results yet, but based on all the polling and what we've expected, Bernie Sanders looked like a lock to win California. I guess the big question tonight, what you're probably watching, is what's that margin going to be?
Yeah, I mean, because there are 2 elements out of the California primary. There's the top line, Bernie Sanders wins the state, and the Associated Press has already called it, I've seen, for Bernie Sanders. And then there's the real story about the delegate count, the proportional delegations of dividing them, statewide vote, dividing them by the 53 congressional districts. The one thing I'm struck about Sanders, I'm curious if any of you, is that California, when you look at the presidential primaries in the last few elections, Democrats have picked kind of the establishment candidates. They picked Hillary Clinton in 2008 over Barack Obama. They picked Hillary Clinton in 2016 over Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders winning California, to me, is an interesting moment in this discussion of the Democratic Party in the state. I don't know if it's a one-time thing or it's some kind of a shift, but it is interesting that he has made significant inroads and could pay off for him tonight by the time we get all the votes.
It's hard to draw conclusions about any one election about what it says about the state, but you're right. I mean, this is a state that Jerry Brown was governor for a long time, and now Bernie Sanders is winning the state. And we should note that Bernie Sanders has won California. The AP is projecting that. The LA Times as well is going with that projection. So that's the big headline tonight from California. Not a surprise, but we can now report that Bernie Sanders will win California. And again, the big thing is by how much. How many of those 415 delegates is he going to put in his column? I'd also like to welcome into our discussion now the LA Times' Erin Logan. Erin's with us by phone from Washington, D.C., where she covers politics with us. Erin, you were in Virginia today, and I'm curious what you picked up from voters there, because Joe Biden hardly spent any time in the state or any money. Mike Bloomberg dropped $18 million on TV ads, and yet everyone, it seems, came home to Joe Biden today. What's your sense of why that is, this late break toward Biden? Maybe we don't have Erin on the phone. We'll work to get Erin on the phone here. But David, what's your sense? I mean, this is, you know, I guess Jan Hook's analysis, you're telling me, Janet Hook's writing this piece about, and it's not that nothing matters, right? But Bloomberg had all the money. Warren had all the organization. Pete Buttigieg had the, you know, sparkling debate performances. They all had something that Biden didn't. And at the end of the day, what Biden had maybe outweighs all of that. Is that
well, that's right. I mean, you look at Massachusetts. Here's a state where Biden literally did not campaign a day, and yet he won, beating a home state senator and a next-door state senator, Bernie Sanders. When the voters have made up their minds that you're the one they want, it kind of doesn't matter whether you've been on the air with $1 million of advertising, whether you've got all this organization. All of that stuff can matter in a close race. But what we've seen over the last 72 hours since that victory that Biden got in South Carolina was a sudden sort of shift of Democratic public opinion where voters who had been sort of trying to figure out, well, I want someone who can beat Donald Trump. I don't think Bernie Sanders can do it, or maybe I'm not really on board with Bernie Sanders' revolution, but I don't know who the alternative is going to be. They all of a sudden kind of clicked in and said, okay, Biden can do it, let's go with him. And that, you know, you catch a wave, you just ride it.
And I guess, you know, what we're left with, if you're Mike Bloomberg or you're Elizabeth Warren, you know, Senator Harris dropped out long before she could have possibly lost her own state. Amy Klobuchar did it just a couple days before. Warren stayed in, not a good night to lose your own state. I mean, I guess we'll find out probably pretty soon what happens with these other candidates, but is there any way that you can see them staying in?
Well, I suppose maybe vanity.
Right.
But the numbers are going to start to tell a story here for these candidates. And I think that there's also a pressure for these candidates who aren't doing so well, especially among the African-American voters I've been sort of focusing on for the past year, to narrow down this field quickly, and for people who are not doing well to help to consolidate around somebody. But for the Democratic Party, again, to create a race that feels more like a race and not like a, sort of free-for-all, especially with these debates, which a lot of these voters did not enjoy, the bickering, the going back and forth. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation with these other candidates tonight and tomorrow. A lot of soul-searching probably about what to do next.
Yeah, when you run out of runway, you're out of runway. And before we go, John, looking ahead, Biden, Bernie, what do you foresee in terms of? I mean, does this go all the way to the convention in Milwaukee in July?
You talk to California Democrats, and a lot of them, again, party leaders, are certainly okay with that. Because they think they're on the right path here. And again, I look at it, of course, through the California lens first and foremost. I got to wonder what some of those party leaders are thinking tonight. And the person for Californians I got to wonder about is Gavin Newsom, the governor of the state. He endorsed Kamala Harris before she dropped out. He didn't endorse anyone else. His wife endorsed Elizabeth Warren. He would not go that far to do that. What are these party leaders? Where is the call for unity or for what we want and what we think the party should do next? People like Newsom, people like former Governor Brown from California, I want to know where they're going to stand on this. Dianne Feinstein, where do they stand on this? I think that's really the question, I think, for me going forward.
Well, and if there's a singular leader in the Democratic Party these days, it might be President Obama, and he has been very tight-lipped, not wanting to really put his thumb on the scales of this race so far. Okay, I think we do have Aaron Logan back on the phone with us. Aaron, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Aaron, talk to us a little bit about your experience in Virginia today. We know that Joe Biden won handily there, and it's rather remarkable given that he hardly spent any time or money in the state, and yet ultimately voters came home to him. What did you pick up from folks going to the polls today about why maybe Biden was able to run up the score tonight?
I think the primary thing in people's minds was who can beat Trump in November. I talked to a lot of different people. Many of them were excited about supporting Pete or Bernie Sanders, but at the end of the day, when it came to it, they thought that Joe Biden had the best chance of battling Trump in November, so they threw their support behind him.
And, in terms of going forward to the general election, I mean, I think Virginia is probably a light blue state at best, but did people, I mean, how much were people talking about the general election and, Trump versus X? And we've heard about the electability question all throughout the primary, this hypothesis that people were trying to come to about who would be the best candidate. Was that on people's minds today?
Yes, that was the main thing on people's minds. I talked to a woman who was hoping Joe Biden would perhaps elect a more diverse running mate and maybe inspire other people to come out and support him. But at the end of the day, she was hoping that people would come out and support him to battle against Trump in November and beat him.
Yeah, we've known for some time that for Democratic voters, the big question remains the big question, and that's it's November that keeps them up at night. Aaron Logan on the phone for us from Washington, thank you very much. John, David, Tyrone, thank you very much for being with us. We'll see some of you a little bit later on, but thanks for spending some time with us on what I know is a busy night of news gathering and reporting. And
interesting night.
All those things, yeah. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to look now at the role of campaign ads in the 2020 primary. The LA Times invited pollster Frank Luntz onto our set just a few days ago, where he convened a focus group of 22 California Democrats. And the panelists were asked to look at ads from various presidential candidates, and one thing really stuck out, and that is that there are a number of ads this year in which the candidates are using old sound bites from Barack Obama and even old sound bites from one another in order to try and score points. Question is, does that work? Kind of depends. We'll take a look.
You're going to see 30-second and 60-second ads. Some of them have aired on television. Some of them have aired on the web. The goal of these is to influence your vote. Some of them are negative. And I know you're going to tell me that you don't respond to negative ads, and I'm going to tell you, as a pollster, you do. Here's the question. Is it impacting your vote? You're going to start at 0. The greater the impact of the ad, the higher you turn your dial. Okay? Everyone back to 0.
Now let's talk about intelligent cuts. There is a ways to slowly decrease the benefits or raise the eligibility age for Medicare and for Social Security. There's a ways to have more copay on Medicaid, which will do 2 things.
If we need austerity, let it not be austerity on the backs of the most vulnerable people in our country. The elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. Let's have some austerity for billionaires.
Okay, I got to ask you a question. The line stayed really low when Bloomberg was talking. Did you realize that this was a Bernie Sanders ad?
No.
How many of you did not realize it was a Bernie Sanders ad? Was it clear that Bernie Sanders was trying to make Mike Bloomberg look awful?
By the end, yeah. By the end, but not
But somebody was. But somebody was.
And then you find out.
Yeah, we could tell it was negative, I think.
Yeah.
And it was effective because listening to Bloomberg's message, if we're focusing on the messaging, and to hear him talk about Social Security cuts, that really doesn't resonate with people who are part of the working poor or the middle class.
But the question is, does it, when you're watching that ad and you see those comments from Bloomberg, did you feel worse about Bloomberg?
Yeah.
So then the ad is effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially since it's coming from his own mouth.
And that makes it more effective.
The subverted expectations were very effective.
Okay, everyone go back to 0, please. You get the idea.
This is an extraordinary man with an extraordinary career in public service. He revitalized American manufacturing as the head of our middle-class task force. He led our efforts to combat gun violence. He fought to make college more affordable, championed landmark legislation to protect our women from violence. Joe's candid, honest counsel made me a better president and a better commander-in-chief. And all of this makes him the finest vice president we have ever seen. The best part is he's nowhere close to finished.
Have any of you seen the ad of Barack Obama supporting Mike Bloomberg?
Yes.
How many of you seen that ad?
Yes.
Who does Barack Obama support?
No one officially.
We don't know officially.
I always remember him telling him, don't do it. Don't do it. I mean, in the very beginning,
Telling
don't
Joe
run.
Biden.
Yeah, at the very beginning.
I think he's supporting Bloomberg.
Why?
No.
Why?
He's endorsed him, and
He hasn't
That's the doctor.
He's talked about him, but he's not endorsed.
Who is Barack Obama supporting?
I see this ad, and I now think I'm being lied to because I know for a fact that he hasn't come out and endorsed anyone. So I see that, and I feel like, oh, he's trying to manipulate me by using something out of context.
But he did give those recommendations of those people, those character references at that time. I have to assume that he still stands by it.
But it wasn't for this election.
It's not for this election, but it's a reminder, and as soon as I hear his voice, it's like a pillow straight to 100.
None of those ads matter. Hillary tried to run off on Barack's coattail. It didn't work. So I'm sick of everyone trying to use the great President Barack Obama.
Let me go back. I want to go back to the ads. I'm going to go back to 0, please.
I don't know anybody I've worked with in my career, and I've been hanging around a long time, who does more to create the future than you, Mike. Mike Bloomberg transformed the city of New York into a global leader on public health and environmental stewardship. While others talked about climate change, Mike took action. He helped reduce New York's greenhouse gas emissions by 16%. Mike has what every public official should have: passion matched with principle. Your legacy extends well beyond the 5 boroughs to a nation and a world that continues to benefit from the leadership that you have shown, and I am absolutely confident is going to exist in the years to come. The thing I like about Mike, it's not about words. It's always about action.
I'm Mike Bloomberg, and I approve this message.
He has to
balls.
Okay.
That was brilliant.
You liked it.
It was his words talking about this man. It's inconvenient now for Joe. I like them both, But I mean, this is Mike Bloomberg in Joe's own words.
Yeah, but
so
that was Joe's own words 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not him now.
He's saying wonderful things about him. It's a completely legitimate thing to
I feel like it's totally unoriginal.
Yeah.
But I love all the money that Bloomberg is just throwing in there with all the cheesy ads against
I'll
Trump.
give him that much.
And get these pencils with my name on it.
This ad kind of
Let him
made
blow
me
his money.
hate them both because
Yeah.
I then had to remember that as I was sitting as a child in Bloomberg's Republican New York City, Joe Biden was congratulating him for being a great mayor. So it kind of ruined both of them for me.
It's an interesting insight right there into how an ad that was designed to be positive not only worked against the candidate perhaps, but also worked against the other candidate featured in the ad. Now, these kinds of TV ads can have a big impact in the moment, but they may also have a deeper, longer-lasting impact on our political culture. For that, I want to bring in retired General Wesley Clark, who, after retiring from a military career that included his job as NATO commander during the Kosovo War in 1998 and 99, ran for president as a Democrat in 2004. Clark from Arkansas ran the campaign as a moderate. He jumped into the race after several groups launched a Draft Clark effort encouraging him to run, and now he heads an organization aimed at decreasing divisions in our politics. General Clark, thank you so much for joining us on this primary night. Really,
pleasure to be with you.
Thrilled to have you with us. Do you see? Well, let's talk about the ads first. The people in the focus group say they don't like it, that they figure out what's going on in those ads. But you think that these negative ads, they're not such a murder-suicide pact where they blow up the person running the ad and the person they're attacking. You think a lot of times they actually work.
Negative ads work. There's no doubt about it. Most people they're about politics like I kind of am about baseball. So at the end of the summer, I start getting really interested in who's going to be in the World Series, but I don't really start really looking at the players until maybe the end of September. I know I should do better, and they know they should do better. But those negative ads, the first negative ads that come out that nail people, it has a huge impact.
We're looking at a primary right now where the guy who's run the most ads is not the person running over everybody else left in the field tonight. Joe Biden has not run the most ads. He has not had the best debate performances, and yet he is the one, when we're seeing the field finally consolidate, he is clearly now the alternative to Bernie Sanders. How do you think that has happened, and what do you think it says about where we are, where the Democratic Party is at this moment?
Well, first of all, party loyalty is a very strong thing. A lot of the people who vote in primaries, and it's a smaller electorate in a primary than it is even in the general election. And in general elections, 45% of the people, sometimes more, don't vote. So you're dealing with a slice of a slice in a primary. A lot of these people are party loyalists. They go back a long, long way. When I ran, people would come up to me and say, I'm a yellow dog Democrat. I guess that meant that it didn't matter who was running as long as you were from the right party. That always kind of put me off because I wanted them to vote for me, but it's the party label. It's the continuity. And this is what Mike Bloomberg couldn't bring in. He had crossed over and become a Republican to be mayor, and then he came back to where his values are, where I believe they are. He's basically a moderate, and he's probably naturally a Democrat, but he didn't have the loyalty. Joe Biden's got his whole adult life in politics. He knows people in every state. He and his wife have helped people in every state. When I was running, Joe spent 3 days with my wife while she was campaigning in Delaware for me during that primary. So Joe's wife came to Arkansas for a fundraiser about a month ago. We went there. Of course we talked about that. Of course we remembered that. And this is the stuff of politics. It's personal. So I think Mike Bloomberg he has a really important point when he, as he said last night with Don Lemon on CNN, he says, I've run big organizations, and the United States government's a big organization. We need people that can do it, but those aren't the people that usually run in politics. No, they're not. They're not. It's just about personal touch. It's about leadership. It's about giving something back. It's about values. It's not just about competence. It's about being able to mobilize the spirit, the energy, and the values and commitment of people.
Well, and
It's loyalty.
It seems like that's one of the things. That's the one place where Joe Biden has the edge on the rest of the field. Is that people talk about empathy and humanity, being a human. He may not have the most sort of detailed policy or the most progressive policy on health care, and he's not going to be up there winning the debates on style points. But when he talks about his experience, when he talks about loss, people really relate to that. Right. Do you think that's, just sort of emotionally, I guess when you are voting for a presidential candidate and wanting someone to be president, you want to have that emotional connection with them?
It's really no different than student council election. When you're running for high school student council, you have to talk about getting more pavement in the parking lot so your cars don't get dirty. Okay, and maybe that's not the greatest issue, but you have to reach people's heart. Politics is about the heart. It's not really about the mind, because the details sort of flow past. It's about whether someone, it's not do they like you, it's do they feel you? Do they feel that you have values, that you're strong enough to live those values, that those values, they may not agree with every one of them, but those values are praiseworthy, that they will do something for the nation. And as you move up the economic scale, people more and more vote their interests. But as you move down the scale, they more and more vote their values. And so everybody keeps talking about these working class whites and how Trump won. That yes, you've got to appeal to people's hearts. And I think Joe can do that.
Have you watched this primary and seen any parallels to 2004? Because that was an election cycle when you decided to run, where you have a Republican incumbent in the White House seeking a second term, and you have an electorate that's looking at a field of candidates. No one's ever really done it before. You're not really sure. There seemed to be a void that you tried to fill in terms of a national security background, and you didn't win. But the guy who won, ultimately, a lot of people looked at him and said, let's go with Kerry because, he's got this military background. That's going to be important in the middle of the Iraq War. Yeah. Do you see any connection, any similarities? I know it's a long way from then, especially in political years, not just regular years, but do you see any way about how this has played out so far that's reminded you of what happened in 2004?
Yeah, in a couple of ways. The first thing is that in the election as it spun up toward 2003, Howard Dean came on very strong. Now, Howard Dean was the former governor of Vermont, but he was representing a progressive viewpoint. And this is not the way that the Clinton administration survived. When Bill Clinton became president, of course, I was in the Army, I didn't really follow this, but this is in retrospect as I've learned it. He had a way of triangulating. So he'd say, well, here's the Democrats over here, here's the Republicans, I'll encroach on the Republicans, that way I can bring them. And, his motto was responsibility. And so he wasn't like a, hey, we're going to do everything for you and give you everything kind of a Democrat. He was like, personal responsibilities, that's important. Yeah. So he moved to the right, and that's how he got elected. That's how he was popular. That's why he had such an incredibly high approval rating, even after the impeachment. Yeah. And people in the Democratic Party felt like somehow we'd lost our moorings. It worked for Clinton, but here comes George Bush, and it's like, hey, spend your way back into security. Don't worry about the war. Just go spend some money at a mall. Let's have it on the tax cut. We're going to give you back your money. And so the Democrats tried to reach back to their traditional moorings. They couldn't quite do it with Howard Dean. John Kerry didn't get it. But this progressive force has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And especially because when Barack Obama became president, he actually adopted the principles of the recovery that had been set out by Hank Paulson. And his Treasury Secretary was part of that. And so it was not a Main Street recovery, it was a Wall Street recovery, to say a word. Now, it set the stage for a long recovery, but it didn't help a lot of 5 million people whose homes were in arrears, and it didn't help a lot of people get jobs right away. And it fed the progressive impulse. And that's the same impulse that Howard Dean was trying to stoke. I had Michael Moore come to one of my rallies. It's the best rally I ever had, and Eli Siegel, who was my campaign manager, says, this is the best rally we've seen in New Hampshire since RFK ran. We had 3,000 people packed into a gym. And it was because of Michael Moore and his progressive tilt. And I was a moderate, but I also, look, I mean, I grew up in the military, and I mean, from the time I was married at 22, government house, government job, kid was in a government school, don't make much money, depend on the government. That's kind of like socialism.
General Clark, I'm really glad to have you here, and I know we're going to continue to talk over the course of the night. It's great to hear about your experiences as a candidate and your experience still in the political arena. So thank you very much for being with us. It's great to have you. And thank you to all of you for sticking with us on this live stream. We'll be right back in 60 seconds.
The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
And thanks for being with us. It's after 8:30 now, the bottom of the hour. Here's the latest on the Super Tuesday contest now. We're going to go back to Ben Welsh upstairs on the data team. He is upstairs in our building, and I believe he has the results tracking the numbers coming out of these 14 states and territories that voted today. Ben?
Hey, Eli, let's take a look at the results. So since we last looked, the overall picture is the same with one major difference. As we've already covered, the state of California has been called for Bernie Sanders. You may wonder, with only 5% of precincts in, how are we able to call the state for one of the candidates? That's because our partner, the Associated Press, and other pollsters survey voters as they exit the polls on Election Day and do other research which allows them to sort of project what the ultimate outcome will be before the ballots are in. And when there's a really wide gap between that and the first place candidate and the second place candidate, they'll go ahead and call the state. And so that's why we see that happening in this case. But beyond the big news, which is that Bernie has won, we can dig into the results we already have to learn a little bit about what California voters think about the presidential nominees. Let's have a look. Here's our state on our page on LATimes.com, where we have the current standings. So with 6% of precincts reporting, Bernie Sanders is in first place with 27% of the vote. Believe it or not, in second place there is Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York. He has 19% of the vote currently. We'll keep our eye on that through the night to see if he can maintain that second place finish. But he is currently ahead of Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg. If we scroll down and look at the map, we can see the geography of what's happened so far. So 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton defeated Bernie Sanders in many of the central counties of the state, as well as LA and the South. But so far, Bernie is winning those areas. And that's a big reason why the AP says he will come out on top tonight. You'll see 2 pink counties here on the map, or maybe 3, and those are the areas where Michael Bloomberg is actually in the lead. Now, the former New York mayor has not had a good night, and you may have wondered, where is his support coming from? We may have found his base, wine country in Northern California. It includes Sonoma and Napa counties. That's where he's doing well so far. We've yet to hear from LA County, the largest county in the state and the most populous in the United States, where more than 10 million people live. Those results will come in soon on LATimes.com on a separate page, where we'll be tracking both the presidential results and all the down ballot races, including our contested county district attorney race and all of the rest. If you're interested in keeping tabs of the results as they come online, go ahead and log onto your web browser and go to LATimes.com/Super Tuesday, where you'll be able to see these pages I've just shown you and keep track of the results as they arrive.
All right, Ben, thanks very much. We'll keep up with you tonight. I would expect that a lot of those early results do not include the day of the election vote, which might explain why Biden is not running as well so far as where he is probably going to end up when the night is done. We're going to spend a little more time talking about state and local politics now. Voters in LA County who cast ballots in person today, well, they encountered the new and much talked about VSAP system. The letters stand for Voting Solutions for All People. It's LA's upgrade to its voting system, a decade-long project that cost around $300 million. There are nearly 5.5 million registered voters in LA County, and as this newspaper has reported, the stakes are high that the rollout of the machines is successful. So how did it go for voters in LA? We went out and asked.
I've only been here for literally less than 10 minutes. Quick in and out. I like coming to the poll to vote, to cast my vote that way. So as comparing it, it went a little bit faster.
I'm used to pushing the buttons, and now we're on a screen, and you got to slide everything and push the button. And some of us older folks aren't into that new technology stuff.
Well, this was different. I told my son, I wish we'd go back to the push button, but this was going to be how we voted for president when that time comes. And they said yes, and I think I've got it now where I do understand it.
Anybody ever do like Scantrons and you're like, what if I didn't fill this in correctly? And they're not going to count my vote because I didn't like fill the bubble in fully. There's like no danger of that happening electronically. So there's no hanging chads here. So this is pretty exciting.
They love the Scantrons. With us now is our Sacramento Bureau Chief, John Myers, back with us. You've been covering this shift for California, the decades-long shift to this new voting system. This is a long time coming. What are you hearing about how things went today? Because obviously we talked to some people who are pretty happy to have it be a little smoother, but it wasn't smooth for everybody.
It was not. And there are two things that I think is really important to talk about at the outset when we watch these California returns come in. The first of all is that there are 15 counties in the state that have adopted a new system called the Voters' Choice System, Voters' Choice Act. LA County was one of those. LA County has a unique version of it, but this basically means you're mailing out ballots and you are not having traditional polling places. You're having these vote centers that you can do more things in. LA went one step further by creating these brand new machines that you talked about a moment ago that are touchscreen machines with these paper products on them. And we found a lot of lines, a lot of broken machines, a lot of frustration. Lines that were 3 hours long in some parts of Los Angeles County. I love those LA voters that we just heard from there. I think they were probably earlier voters in the day on Tuesday. By lunchtime and later into today and into the evening, those lines have gotten very long in some places, machines that have gone down, and some confusion about all of this. And I think, the challenge here, of course, Eli, is that the whole country is going to watch California a little bit here. We are the largest jurisdiction. LA County, you're exactly right, 5.5 million voters, more voters than 39 states in the country in Los Angeles County alone. So it's a big deal how this rolls out here. And I think the jury is definitely out as we're watching these votes come in about whether it worked well or needs some more improvement.
Yeah, I read in some of our coverage about how it was going today that there were lines at a polling place, I think downtown at the Ace Hotel. Yeah. There were lines going through the stairwell all the way down and out the front door. And, that's really a failure. Not right. We can sort of idealize people who are willing to wait in line, but people shouldn't have to wait in these lines to vote. I know that the state and various counties are trying to remedy that, but that's discouraging, right? A lot of people don't have the time to sit and wait.
It definitely is. And I mean, what we don't know yet is we don't know what the lines exactly were all about. We don't know what part of that were problems with the machinery, the operations, and what part of that's turnout. We don't know what the turnout is yet, either in LA County or across California. Enormous amounts of interest in this election. Easily the most consequential presidential primary in this state in a generation. We moved the primary up to be part of Super Tuesday. We're in Super Tuesday. And I think you had a lot of people really getting engaged. And it's not just in Los Angeles and Northern California and the Central Valley as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what that turnout number is. And then, to your point, we have to ask questions about, are we doing the system properly? Do we need to do it better?
Well, and we're in a moment where you have rampant foreign interference in an election. You have a president who, for political reasons, has looked at what happened in Iowa with the failure to count the votes properly. He continues to talk about that in his rallies.
And California talked about it in the last election.
Right, so the integrity of the vote is really critical and making sure that it is beyond reproach. Do you think that by November, California is going to have things figured out? I guess I shouldn't ask you to predict, but...
Well, the challenge is that there are 58 elections in California. Every county runs its own election. Right. They're all a little bit different. But I do think that this is going to raise some pretty good questions in LA County, especially about what else do they need to do. I think poll worker training is a huge thing you hear all the time. If the poll workers don't know how to tell the voters how to use it, then the voters don't know how to use it. But the big part to, I think, this is that people need to remember they have more ways to vote than just on Election Day. This state is primarily an absentee ballot, vote by mail state right now. And people have lots of opportunities. Of course, they don't like to vote early in a primary sometimes when their favorite candidate drops out, but they do have opportunities all the way to Election Day to even drop that vote by mail in a ballot box. And I think in the general election, it's going to be pretty clear who they're going to pick from.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that while you're here, about the fact that a lot of voters, I mean, when California's voting began, it was February 3rd, Iowa Caucus Day. The race looked a lot different on that day than it does, you know, in these final couple of days here. And anybody who cast a ballot for Mayor Pete or for Senator Klobuchar,
Andrew Yang
dropped
Yang,
out. That's right. So, ancient history. I can't remember who is Andrew Yang. But you know, if you're one of those voters and you're calling your county clerk, sorry, no do-over.
Yeah, if you've mailed the ballot in or you've cast the ballot, it is what it is. But if you didn't, if you held on to it, obviously you've got another choice. And I knew a lot of people that I talked to in Northern California who were holding that ballot. They might have filled it out, but they had not submitted it for the very reason you're talking about. And they could get a new one. They could go get it and change it out, and they did in some cases. But I also think it's important to note that Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar or Andrew Yang, but especially Buttigieg, you know, if he picks up delegates tonight, which I think there's a pretty good chance he'll pick up some in some of these congressional districts. Well, Buttigieg has endorsed Biden. Those are probably Biden delegates, so it doesn't mean the vote doesn't count. I know people feel that way in some ways, but it is the nature of these amazingly contested primaries. I mean, it's been an election season unlike any we've seen in a long time.
Right. There's a lot of benefits to voting early, but in this case, right, it broke so late that you can understand why a lot of people held on to their ballots and why a lot of others wish they had. Yeah. John, thanks so much for being with us. I know it's a busy night, but it's great to have you down here on the first floor hanging out with us. Well, the outcome of the race for LA District Attorney could reshape the role and the mission of the prosecutor's office. Incumbent Jackie Lacey has strong support among law enforcement, but she has come under fire by criminal justice reform advocates. Her opponents, George Gascon and Rachel Rossi, favor a more progressive approach. Early Monday morning, the battle came right to Lacey's doorstep.
Right now, get off.
Good morning.
Get off of my porch.
Shoot me?
I will shoot you. Get off of my porch.
Can you tell Jackie Lacey that we're here?
I don't care who you are. Get off of my porch.
We will get off your
right
porch.
now.
Can you tell
We're
me?
calling the police right now.
Good. He pulled a gun and pointed it at my chest. We're here for the community meeting, Jackie Lacey.
Jackie Lacey,
Maybe you'll shoot me in the back.
Jackie Lacey will go.
Jackie Lacey will go.
In an emotional press conference, Lacey apologized for her husband's actions. The LAPD released a statement indicating that they have opened an investigation into that incident. LA Times reporter James Quealy has been covering this DA's race. He joins us now by phone. James, what a wild end to this race these last couple of days.
Yeah, that was not the video I was expecting to wake up to yesterday morning.
No. Do you have any idea of how it played? I mean, you know, again, if folks are making up their minds, sort of holding on to their ballots because of the presidential race till the end, you think that could have been a factor?
This is, obviously far from scientific, but we've talked to a few voters leaving polling stations today, and a number of them have mentioned that they were either uninterested in the DA's race, not following it, or possibly leaning towards the district attorney herself before viewing the video and then choosing to dig deeper. We had a couple of people tell us they voted for Rachel Rossi as a result of seeing that footage. Other people mentioned they had come out that otherwise wouldn't. In a broader sense, right, with the early voting, we don't know how many people cast their ballots possibly in favor of Jackie Lacey before that footage surfaced. We obviously also don't know. There are some consultants that think she could receive something of a sympathy boost, actually, among voters. Not everyone is going to universally agree with the tactics of the protesters showing up on her door at 5 a.m., 5:30 a.m. They very well may not likely agree with her husband's response, but they may still feel for Jackie herself.
You know, a lot of people who have watched this race play out, who've watched it closely like you have, some folks have looked at it as sort of a microcosm for the broader Democratic Party and looking at sort of an establishment candidate and then the fault lines between the establishment and also, these more progressive candidates who want bigger change, faster results. Is that a good frame, a good way for people who maybe haven't plugged into this to sort of view this and to see the results tonight?
Generally speaking, yeah. Jackie Lacey is definitely more of a moderate Democrat, kind of, I guess what the phrase would be, a blue dog Democrat. You know, she's pretty pro-law enforcement, centrist person. Gascon and Rachel Rossi definitely run further left, picked up some endorsements in that vein. There has been some painting of Jackie as a conservative throughout the race. Whether or not that's fair is kind of up to people's analysis, but, you know, she has large backing from police unions. She, at one point, this may have been a mistake on the part of her campaign. She didn't know who this person was, but she actually had a Trump fundraiser working for her at one point. So there's been a little bit of, kind of as we saw with the sheriff's race a few years ago here, kind of painting of the incumbent as a conservative, hoping to gin up that energy of the further left voters.
You know, the police union can be a big endorsement in terms of helping with, you know, organization, getting out the vote, people knocking on doors. Gascon got Senator Harris to endorse him. What are the other sort of factors that that you're looking at in terms of tilting this one way or another? I mean, did the Harris endorsement, do you think, have an impact?
The Harris endorsement may have helped Gascon. Harris, though, as we remember, you know, part of her presidential bid was undone by the idea that she was not really a terribly progressive prosecutor, that she was actually more in Lacey's camp, kind of a moderate traditional prosecutor. So that, I don't know how well that resonated. Gascon has launched a heavy bid in South LA. Rather, sorry, I misspoke, not him, an outside committee, an outside expenditure supporting him has launched a big get out the vote effort in South LA, and he did pick up Maxine Waters' endorsement. So that may have helped him more so on the ground. He also picked up the county Democratic Party's endorsement a few months back, and as you know, that usually doesn't go against the incumbent, so that was a big win for him as well.
It's fair to say, I guess, that Democrats are paying a little more attention to criminal justice issues these days, and that you know, the center has sort of shifted on this. You know, 20 years ago, you know, Bill Clinton is getting elected saying, you know, or 30 years ago almost, getting elected, you know, with this sort of tough on crime thing that was necessary for Democrats to not appear weak. And now you have a Republican president who is bragging about criminal justice reform, and you have more of a consensus around sentencing reform. Is that broader, those sort of broader, you know, winds that are blowing on this issue, is that really, are we seeing that play out in this race in terms of a DA and Jackie Lacey, who's kind of, you know, been there for a little while, 2 terms now, seeking a third, who says she wants to stop locking people up and you know, engage in reforms, but you got all these activists out there who are saying, look, where are the results? It seems like sort of, again, a snapshot of something that's happening more broadly in our politics.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some policy positions that separate, you know, Lacey and her challengers along those lines. Lacey is still supportive of the death penalty. Both Gascon and Rossi are starkly against. Lacey, she's somewhat tried to rebrand herself a little bit in the run-up as more of a progressive, actually oddly mirroring some policies of Gascon, despite some of their tense exchanges in the primary. You know, she moved along with a program to expunge a number of marijuana convictions, which was something Gascon's office had done up in San Francisco about a year earlier. But there are areas that she has been something of a thought leader on, and she just doesn't really publicize as well. You know, she's been a long-time advocate for mentally ill defendants, trying to run diversion programs, trying to cut down on actually prosecuting those defendants for lower-level nonviolent crimes. Whether the results actually match the rhetoric is something that's up for debate. Her office has filed misdemeanor crimes, for instance, at a way higher rate than Gascon's office did when they were in the same terms. There was also recently, you know, a RAND report that showed there's somewhere upwards of 3,000 inmates in the LA County Jail that could qualify for some form of a diversion program, whereas Lacey's signature program in that arena has only diverted about 400 defendants in the last year. So, you know, there's a little bit of question of when the rubber actually meets the road when it comes to what Lacey says on these policies versus what the stats show.
Sure. I'm going to let you go. One last thing. Do we have any sense of the results? I know it's early, but have we gotten any picture of this race yet?
So I was about to make a joke about a 0-0-0 tie, but I'm just looking at the first round of what's come in. Lacey, I'm seeing out in front big on early reports. She's got 54% of the vote. Gascon and Rossi are both hovering around 22%, but it's obviously very early.
Yeah, so that's a big margin. I guess we're not ready to make a call yet, but James, we know you'll keep an eye on it. Really appreciate all your reporting on this, your knowledge, and taking the time tonight to join us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, James.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. All right, on to the intersection now of politics and culture. He seems perhaps an unlikely youth icon, but 78-year-old Bernie Sanders has emerged as the cool candidate. Supporters packed the LA Convention Center on Sunday night, maybe you heard, for a rally headlined by Chuck D of Public Enemy.
Los Angeles! Are you awake tonight? Put your fists in the air if you believe truth, the power, and the truth. Here come the drums! Hey, go, 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 go,
It speaks volumes that this is the first presidency that they've come out and supported, or the first candidate. So, I mean, you've seen their track record. They've always amplified my community's voice.
We are Enemy Radio! Use your minds, y'all!
We are going to raise the minimum wage so that every worker in America can earn a decent living. We're going to have equal pay for equal work.
This is the first candidate that I felt really cared about my issues.
All right, with us now to help answer the question about what makes a candidate cool. What's the secret with Bernie? Two cool cats, LZ Granderson here and Randy Lewis. Thank you guys for being down here. Really appreciate it.
Good to be here.
What's the deal? I mean, the generational thing in this election, in this primary, is really remarkable when you have all the young people with Bernie and all the older people with Biden now. What do you make of how, Bernie Sanders has become a cultural figure?
He really has, and it's interesting because he appeals to so many young voters that it goes hand in hand with the kind of people from the music business that he's attracted. You've got Killer Mike rappers, Lizzo. He's got a lot of people from the indie rock community, Vampire Weekend, Bon Iver. But he's got some old timers too. Neil Young is a big Bernie
Fish
supporter.
the other night, right?
It's he just keeps piling them on. He's really attracted a lot more from the music community than really any other of the Democratic candidates have so far.
What do you make of that, of the sort of cultural cachet that Bernie Sanders had? I mean, Bernie Sanders, I don't think, has thought about what he wears to work in a long time. I don't think anybody knows what kind of music he listens to, right? He doesn't seem like he's all that attuned to the culture, and yet he's become a cultural phenomenon of sorts.
Well, I think part of it has to do with his presentation, and you talked about what he wears. Well, he looks like the cool old uncle who you just want to hear stories from, right? But the stories he's talking about are stories that are relatable to a large swath of people, which is why he has the excitement that I don't think any other Democrat has shown. He talks about income inequality. He talks about fairness. He talks about things that young people are passionate about, and also artists are passionate about in their work, in their lyrics, in the movies that they direct or produce or write. And so he's touching on a lot of things that artists and creative people can tap into, while also looking like the cool uncle with the New York accent that you can have a beer with. And those two things have made him the cultural figure that he's become today.
Do you see any comparison to other, talk about Bill Clinton going on Arsenio Hall and playing the saxophone, these moments that kind of humanize some of these politicians. With Bernie, right, we're not seeing that. He's not really bending over backwards trying to humanize himself. He's just putting his authentic self out there, I guess, and fighting for what he believes in. And that is getting more of a reaction than anything else anybody's done.
Yeah, I think he's attracting the artistic community, which tends to be more progressive thinking, just temperamentally. So they kind of align with the things that Bernie's talking about. And this is why he draws them in. He doesn't seem to be pandering to them or just really courting these endorsements, but they speak to the issues that a lot of these artists are really passionate about.
And it's really interesting. I covered 2016, and his messaging and his approach has matured over these last 3 to 4 years. Yeah, you can certainly make an argument if that, there's reasons to believe that the establishment, as he likes to call it, worked against him. But he's also has learned from some of his own sort of self-inflicted wounds. Case in point, when he was noticing, or his campaign was noticing, he wasn't attracting a lot of African-American voters, well, he turned to Cornel West. Well, anyone who's really plugged into the African-American community know he was canceled a long time ago, and black people really weren't paying attention to Cornel West like that, but he didn't know. So what has he done? He's sharpened his tools. He's gotten people who are able to tap into elements of communities around the country that he was missing. Yeah, his message resonates, but he needs to resonate. And in order to do that, he needed to kind of fill those holes. Another case that I think has really been interesting, if you noticed, when he first ran, it was the millionaires and the billionaires. Well, now it's been learned that he's a millionaire. Now it's just the billionaires. You know, so he's made a little slight adjustment, but no one's really calling him out on it because his passion still registers as genuine.
Since we're talking about culture, I want to ask you, we looked tonight at the results, pretty clear the Democratic nominee is going to be either Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden. Maybe a long way to go figuring out which one. But when you look forward and you look to November, the fall election, and you look at a matchup against Donald Trump, who is not only the president, but is, a reality TV star, really a media character first and foremost, and a person who understands, whether he has a lot of endorsements from cultural figures or not, he's a person who understands how to use the media, how to make himself a cultural phenomenon, how to make his rallies, how to make his red hats part of a culture. Maybe it's a different culture, but he understands communicating, mass communicating, and he understands sort of cultural movements and what binds people to him. Do you think that Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden can compete with that in terms of the emotional connections that they draw on, and can some of these cultural figures perhaps help with that?
No.
No.
Cultural figures won't help. I think we're past the day in which you can prop up someone who's cool, and then through osmosis, you come across as cool as well. I think Hillary Clinton kind of proved that. I mean, she had Beyonce and Jay-Z with her, and she still didn't register as cool herself. So I don't think people are falling for that okie dokie anymore.
Yeah, it's a different era now, and in the era of social media, every individual voter has their own platform, and the candidates can reach out directly, and they don't need the intermediary a lot of times. But there's some cool factor depending on who it is that they get that can connect with some people that may be undecided.
I would say that in the case of Bernie Sanders, he really doesn't need any surrogates. But from my own reporting and observations, I would assume that Joe Biden does.
What about AOC, though? I mean, when you're right, Bernie had the heart attack, and he was not a frontrunner at that point. Does the big rally in New York City, AOC is out there, huge crowd, and whether it was the rally or whether it was her endorsement or not, but that was really the moment where he started to trend up, Elizabeth Warren started to trend down, and those trend lines haven't really changed, and now we are where we are. Maybe she's not a figure from the culture, and that she's not an artist, but she has a following, right? In this age of social media, I mean, maybe she's more important than musicians and other people. I mean, because that's an instance where someone endorsing a candidate really did seem to turn the key.
Well, definitely that, and then there was also aspects of Elizabeth Warren's policies that were being sort of exposed, or at least looked at more carefully at that time as well. So I think it was a combination of things that caused that sort of swift change, if you will. But in terms of trying to find other cultural figures beyond just artists to help boost the campaign, you're absolutely correct. She's more than just an elected official. She is a cultural figure. And the question is, we know Bernie can tap into this energy. Joe Biden has tapped into a different energy. It's a pragmatic energy. It doesn't lend itself to the creative force, if you will. And so how he finds people to help boost his energy level is going to be really interesting, because Bernie seems a lot more natural.
Yeah, and you trot out Barack Obama and all the old, it just sort of feels a little retro.
But done.
Yeah.
And one of the things we've seen, too, is that some artists are really pushing just to get young people to get involved in the process, to register to vote. Taylor Swift came out in 2018, and within 5 days of when she endorsed candidates in the Tennessee congressional races, nearly 500,000 new people registered to vote. Ariana Grande has done it at her concerts and getting tens of thousands of people registered. So that's getting even, a greater voter base among the young voters.
But it doesn't generate headlines. I mean, I remember Mayor Pete was in Iowa, and he had Mandy Moore at a rally, and they had Kevin Costner out there doing voiceover videos. Those things just don't really wow people the same way maybe that they used to.
No, they don't.
Because they're so present on social media all the time.
Yeah,
you don't need to
they're
see
not even, hard to get a hold of. They're, you can go on Instagram right now and see what LeBron is doing. He's playing basketball right now, but I mean, he's going to tweet how he feels right away. Again, it's about the connection feeling genuine, I think, more than anything else. And I keep going back to Joe Biden because, again, just based on my own reporting, he appears to be the pragmatic choice. We're picking Joe because we believe he can beat Donald Trump. When people talk about Bernie, they're talking about his policies and his passion and being genuine. And that is how they defeat Bernie or Donald Trump. Those are two different paths. And so because of that, it feels as if the former vice president is going to struggle a little bit finding a surrogate to come in to boost because he himself hasn't found a way to tap into the energy.
This is a fun conversation. I know we got to wrap it up, but I would just ask, do you see anybody in this town who, is going to come out of the space and be on the Trump team? I mean, we know Kanye went to the White House and maybe he sort of walked it back and that got a huge reaction and that was a wild day in the Oval Office. But do you see any people who are going to step forward and support him? I mean, Trump loves to run against Hollywood and bash elitists and, whether it's media or entertainment or whatever. But he likes it when people from that industry come out and support him. I think John Voight's been to the White House. I don't know how many times, flies on the plane with him. If you're with him, then he's great with it. Do you have any idea if any...
I don't know beyond the usual suspects. Ted Nugent's a fan, right. Kid Rock's an admirer. They've been to the White House, and so we'll probably be seeing more of them, but I'm not hearing rumblings of...
It's hard to imagine anyone who wants to work in this town being public with it. Privately, they may, but publicly, it's going to be difficult.
So that's the problem. They go to the White House, they want to keep it private, and Trump's going to invite all of the reporters into the Oval and be like, look who I got.
Right.
Yeah, isn't
this cool?
Yeah, it was private for 5 seconds. Randy, LZ, thank you so much for coming down here. It's great to chat with you. It was a fun conversation. Really appreciate all the work that you guys do for us. So thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank
you. And thanks to all of you with us on this live stream. We'll be back in 60 seconds.
The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
And welcome back to Pulse of the Nation, California Decides, a special live stream from the Los Angeles Times. I'm Eli Stokols, coming to you live from the LA Times studios. We're going to continue exploring the intersection of politics and culture, and we're going to take a look at how Super Tuesday is playing out, where else? In Hollywood. Celebrities have gathered tonight at the Abbey in West Hollywood for a watch party and fundraiser for former Senator Barbara Boxer's PAC for a Change. And LA Times' Seema Mehta joins us now by phone from that event. Hey, Seema, how's it going tonight?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, we're chilling here. I got Wes Clark ready to come back and talk more politics, but I want to hear more about how it's going and how some of these Hollywood progressives are feeling about the results tonight. I know it's early in California as far as the big numbers, but a lot of states in the win column for Joe Biden.
Right, and Senator Boxer is obviously an endorser of former Vice President Biden, and she was reading off the state totals for both Biden and Sanders and American Samoa for Michael Bloomberg, and everyone, well, with the exception of Michael Bloomberg, had a cheering section here. But this is really a big fundraiser for her PAC for a Change. She said she raised a couple $100,000. It's like 400 people here. If you hear in the background, that's Billy Crystal doing stand-up. Lisa Loeb sang earlier. There's Jason Alexander here. There's Aisha Tyler. There's all kinds of actors and actresses having hors d'oeuvres and sipping cocktails and listening to political speeches in between jokes and musical performances.
Well, that crowd, next time we're going to effort a live shot. Tell me, I mean, any sense, though, are people there? I mean, I know that Barbara Boxer is a Joe Biden person, establishment type of person, wants that consensus candidate. Is that where the room is, as far as you can tell? I know that progressives have wanted for a while to sort of know where this is going and to know, okay, we have a candidate. This is going to be the nominee to take on Trump. We're not quite there yet, but the field has consolidated. Do they seem happy about that?
I mean, speaking to her and some other party officials, they felt like today was like really, well, South Carolina leading into today and then today was a changing course. That before that, you know, there was a real possibility of heading to a broker convention. And now, at least for some Biden supporters, there is a lot more confidence than there was a couple of days ago, that they think that he has the ability to amass the majority of delegates before the convention and to stave off a broker convention. And there's relief. There's a sense of relief.
Are there a lot of Bernie folks there? I mean, is anybody?
There are some, yeah. There are definitely some Bernie folks here, but everyone's sort of getting along. I mean, it's not the usual. Sometimes when you're with Biden folks and Bernie folks, it can get a little tense. I mean, but everyone here is pretty much having a good time, and they're contributing to their favorite political cause, and they're seeing some pretty great entertainment. So everyone's behaving, but there is definitely a vocal Bernie contingent, which isn't surprising because California looks like I believe AP has called California for Senator Sanders.
Right.
He obviously has a lot of support here.
Right. We're still waiting to see the margins, but we know that the top line result is that Bernie will win California. And I guess the moral tonight is that real life is not Twitter. Twitter's not real life. People actually who are at each other all day long on social media can get along in real life, especially if there's an open bar.
Right.
Seema Mehta, thank you so much for joining us from West Hollywood tonight. It's a nice assignment on election night. I appreciate it very much. We'll leave you to it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Dropping out when you're a presidential candidate is a heavy thing to do. Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar's exit from the race earlier this week and their prompt endorsements of Joe Biden, they helped clarify the shape of the Democratic race for the nomination. And in the weeks ahead, and perhaps even sooner, we may hear more of these speeches from the other candidates as well, Mike Bloomberg and Elizabeth Warren, talking about you. So what's it like to get to that point to realize time is up? Well, here to give us a sense of sort of how that works and what goes through the mind and how you make those decisions. Back with us is retired General Wesley Clark. You remember, he ran for the Democratic nomination in 2004 and was not the nominee. Even though a lot of people wanted you in that race, and you see a calculation, you see an opening, and at some point you realize maybe it's not going to work out. I guess you probably know when you get into it, like, this is not a slam dunk. I don't know if I'm going to be the nominee.
Well, Joe Biden told me I had a 1 in 3 chance of winning the nomination.
Joe Biden told you that in 2004?
Yeah, before I announced. And so I thought, he said, that's pretty good. I thought, gee, I thought I'd have a better chance on that. That sounds like an uphill battle.
Yeah.
But that's what he told me. He said, but if you get it, if you get the nomination, you'll beat George W. Bush. And so we came in late. We had to start from scratch raising money. The Clintons gave me a huge boost on that. I had a lot of people who'd worked on the Gore campaign also in 2000. And so we raised a lot of money, but we didn't have time or money to do Iowa. And so we knew the Democrats wanted a veteran because there was a war. And so when this guy jumped out of the crowd in January and said, John Kerry, I mean, you were a great commander. You saved my life. You turned the boat around or something after I fell off the boat. It was it was a dramatic moment in the race, and there was so much momentum coming out of Iowa that even though I was going way up in the polls every day in New Hampshire, where I put a lot of effort in, the free media, as they say, the publicity from the win, the momentum, carried him through, and then he'd won 2, and then he was a veteran, and he'd won lieutenant governor and 4. I'd never even run for student council. So if you were a Democratic partisan, you'd say, look, I like Clark. He's a really good guy. But, I mean, why wouldn't you take a guy who's a proven winner in Senate race after? We thought we know.
Well, familiarity, right, is huge, and that's what's propelling Joe Biden here.
Right.
You came in, as you say, as sort of a national security candidate at a time when that was really important, but then John Kerry found a way to sort of fill that space.
He came up. I mean, he had prostate cancer, so he wasn't campaigning. He put $6 million of his own money into this campaign in December and went to Iowa. But he looked at this for years. Now, the thing is that we won. Our strategy was to do well in South Carolina, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona. That's what we had the money for. That's what we prepared for. I won Oklahoma, came in second, and some people came to me from the party and said, "Okay, you won a state. That's great. Now's the time to drop out." My wife says, "What? We're going to drop out after we just won a state?"
Yeah.
So we didn't do it. We stayed in one more week. But the party coalesced, and you know they wanted Kerry. They wanted to get a young guy with more hair on the ticket. They liked John Edwards because he had a couple of kids, and he seemed, you know, Kennedy-esque,
Right.
and he did a good job on his campaigning. And so you could feel the party closing ranks, and there was pressure to let's get this over with. Let's focus on George Bush. Let's don't drag this out.
Well, and it feels
so
like
the money
that's-
dried up.
Right. I mean, it feels like that's what's happening right now. Biden's
absolutely.
raising all this money. He's gotten suddenly. I mean, you know, these dominoes have fallen quickly. He's got Pete behind him. He's got Amy. He's got Beto.
The money dries up
Whataburger.
instantly. It's the people who are behind the money say, okay, that's it, that's enough, no more. You can make the calls. They say, you know, they're probably telling Amy Klobuchar, Amy, you're great. We love you. We love you. But she said, well, can you send money? And you know, they don't. And the same thing probably happened to Pete. But here's the thing. They're not losers. They're winners. They ran great campaigns. They got national recognition. Pete's got a future in this country. He's probably got a little money left over, although you never know how much money you have because when that campaign stops, suddenly bills appear.
Well, I want to ask you, you know, one person who the money drying up is not going to be a problem for is Mayor Bloomberg.
Yeah.
But he sunk $500 million into basically tonight, Super Tuesday. He's won American Samoa. That's it. And, you know, this is not a guy who got rich by being stupid. And so you got to think, right, that he's going to look at the field, look at the fact he got in as sort of a safety net for the establishment and anti-Bernie, and now Biden has sort of filled that space. You got to think that his exit, even though he could fund his way all the way to the convention, I would guess that you don't expect him to do that.
Hard to say. There'll be some discussions between the respective teams, but he believes that he's the only one who can really pull the moderate Republicans in. And he thinks that's going to be a huge thing, and so he's going to sell that. And he's got the luxury of the money, and that gives him time. I want to just say one thing on the emotional side, though. When you announce that you're coming out, people who have supported you, they've put their heart and soul into it. In my campaign, people dropped out of college. People sold their second homes. People did. And, of course, they cry. I mean, grown men and women sobbing in the headquarters. I'm sure that's happened in the case of Mayor Pete and also Amy Klobuchar. People believe. Now, Amy will go back to the Senate. Pete's got his political job in Indiana, so it's not like they don't have anything to go back to.
Well, I wonder, too, you know, and Pete's not mayor anymore, so no one really knows exactly. He could campaign full-time, I suppose. But, you know, when you look at sort of where things go and the emotions of it and the healing, and, yeah, it's hard, right? You've worked for a campaign. You've moved your life to Iowa. You've lived out of a suitcase. When it's over, you know, I suppose if your candidate quickly endorses someone like Joe Biden, you can say, okay, you know, I'm going to get on board. When certain people, you know, when Julian Castro left the race, some of his people were absorbed by the Warren campaign. You have another fight. Do you worry, though, the way this primary is going, do you worry about if this is a Biden and Bernie fight to the convention? Do you worry about the emotions of some of the partisans being able to kind of come back together?
Absolutely.
I mean, unifying is always
This happened
hard.
in 2016.
Right.
We know that there were people who simply wouldn't vote for Hillary. There was just too much ill feeling. And even during that campaign, and Hillary's got the Arkansas connections, I was, you know, all in for Hillary in that. And there were, the Sanders people who came to Arkansas they were kind of tough and rough and you know, you could feel the division. And you could see it wasn't going to heal easily, among the women even. And so I think that's a real issue here. And I think it's very important that whoever is the nominee pick up on the dissatisfaction that young people have across this country. And you look at the Sanders results here in California tonight. Look, this is a tough time if you're a young person. You've got college debt. You've got major uncertainty in the employment market, lots of volatility. Healthcare costs keep going up. You'd like to get married. There's no stability. You've got to have a working spouse. Then there's coronavirus on top of everything else. You may not think that it doesn't look as easy as maybe it did to people my age. You could go out and join Xerox and IBM and have a lifetime career. All you had to do was do a good job in college. young people today say it doesn't work. And I'm not talking about 20-somethings. I'm also talking to people who've been out there fighting for 10, 15 years in the workplace, and they're not happy. And whoever has the Democratic nomination has got to capture that energy, and he's got to reflect it, or she's got to reflect it in the policies. And not just people in the Rust Belt who don't have jobs. It's people out here in urban areas who are well-educated, who want to do well. They want what their parents have. They just can't quite reach it.
Yeah, I mean, those are the things that are driving voters to all kinds of candidates, to the president, to Democratic candidates. I mean, those are salient issues to a lot of people. General Clark, stick with me. It's great to chat with you and have you here, and if you can hang out for a little bit, we want to continue the conversation, but we want to bring in Paul Reichhoff right now. He is the founder of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. It's the first and largest nonprofit organization for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Thanks for being with us. I want to start with a question about Mayor Pete. Obviously, the only one in the field who served in the military was an Afghanistan war veteran. Are you concerned at all with him out of the race now, that there is something of a void there, and that there's no one who can, perhaps in the same way, champion the concerns of post-9/11 veterans?
Well, it's definitely a loss for our community. I mean, Mayor Pete's gone farther than any other post-9/11 veteran so far. I think there'll be a wave, a generation from both parties that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan that are going to seek higher office. Important to note, Tulsi Gabbard technically is still in. You know, she's not doing very well, but she's also a post-9/11 veteran. She serves currently in the Hawaii National Guard. That's part of why she's doing well in the islands, because they have a high percentage of veteran population. But I think the bottom line is not having someone who actually embodies it, who can say, I served in Afghanistan, is going to be a loss for our community. We represent about 20 million people of all generations. That's the veterans population in America. And I think they're really a political jump ball. That's the interesting part of this community, is many of them are independents, many of them are unaffiliated, and they're going to be the kind of voters that Trump and Biden or Sanders are going to have to fight over. And a lot of those issues that they fight over are going to be on national security. It's going to be on defense. It's going to be on how you support the National Guard and how you respond to emergencies like the coronavirus. What kind of leadership do you project? And can you just get a handle on the crisis that hits our country on any given day?
Yeah, and your point is a good one about Congresswoman Gabbard. We apologize for the omission there. She is still in the race. I want to ask you, Paul, in your opinion, is there a candidate now among the sort of final two of Biden and Sanders, and we'll leave President Trump in there as well, among the choices who it looks like the American people will be picking between in November, is there one who stands out to you who might, you think, best represent the concerns of the members of your group, these veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan? Have you made this endorsement yet? Are you contemplating it? Where are you on figuring out of the remaining options, you know, who is going to be best on these issues?
I think most veterans are really going to be looking between Trump and Biden. I think if Sanders is put up against Trump on national defense, he's going to get crushed. You know, as a socialist, as an anti-war Democrat, as someone who hasn't served in the military, I think he's going to be at a huge competitive disadvantage, definitely among Republicans and especially among independents. If it's Biden, he is the father of someone who served. A lot of folks forget that Beau Biden served in Iraq, so he's technically, you know, a part of a military family. Joe Biden had close connection to the military, working as the vice president in the Senate. I worked alongside him and others when we passed the post-9/11 GI Bill that General Clark and others supported over a decade ago. So I think that's a much more interesting fight. But I think that's one piece of this discussion that's often lost. I think we learned tonight that America is less liberal than a lot of people thought. You saw, especially in places like the South, in the Midwest, someone who's more moderate, like Biden, is going to appeal to people because of their national security bona fides and because of their tone. If you're talking about socialism in a place like Alabama or in a place like Florida, where you've got a high percentage of military retirees and active duties, you're going to get annihilated. And I think the Democrats realize that, and that's why they're pushing toward a more moderate candidate like Biden.
It is pretty interesting, and it's another you know, point about how real life is not always reflected on social media. And you know, your other point is interesting too, about how military voters are not a monolith. They're going to make different choices. President Trump has pushed, you know, has touted himself as a sort of defender of the military, and yet he's been pretty upfront about his own inclinations to withdraw from a lot of places. He pulled troops out of Syria the border with Turkey, because he had a phone call with President Erdogan, and it forced a whole, fiasco where Vice President Pence had to go over and negotiate something of a ceasefire. The attack against Iran was another thing that was like, wow, he's been a little uneven. There's been a lot of reporting in books and by a lot of the people who cover this administration about how he doesn't necessarily listen to or empower the National Security Council. And yet, at every rally I go to, he's talking about improving funding for the Pentagon. In his words, he's made the military great again. What do you think, how would you personally sum up his record so far on these defense issues? If we just take the Democrats out of the equation here, what grade would you give President Trump so far on national security matters?
Oh, I'd give him an F. The military was great before Donald Trump, and thankfully the military will be great after him. But he's had an abysmal record. And even now, in the deeply supportive Republican Party, he's starting to see an erosion, and it's because of specific issues like you talked about. He completely abandoned the Kurds. I've never seen a more universally unpopular move in my 20 years since I joined the military and got out. I've never seen something across partisan lines that was so universally condemned as when he decided to leave our allies on the battlefield. And then, of course, we had another controversy where he pardoned war criminals. He basically said, if you're his political ally, you don't have to abide by the rules of war. These are deeply damaging to the general population, to our national security, but also to the veterans' vote. And this comes on the heels of attacking John McCain over and over again, attacking the Khan family over and over again, even getting into fights with people like General Mattis, who used to be his ally and are now on the other side of things. So we have an old saying in our work that there are three core groups of people that are universally popular: babies, puppies, and vets. If you talk about babies, puppies, or vets, you're going to appeal to a very core part of the American population. Trump understands that. That's why he talks about veterans. That's why he talks about national security. He talks a great game. The question is, can Biden or Sanders or whoever it is pierce that rhetoric? Can they actually hold him to task? Can they actually make a compelling alternative? And can they overcome the fact that most Americans default to the Republicans on national security? General Clark's part of a generation that's been trying to push that back, but the Republicans have had a competitive advantage in the general population on national defense. That's going to be a core issue that they're going to have to fight over, and who knows what happens in the meantime. They're going to have to deal with coronavirus. They may have to deal with deploying California National Guard troops to wildfires. We have the Middle East in a very fragile place. But Trump's smart, and he knows, for example, he's going to try to claim victory on Afghanistan right now. He's got what he's called a peace with the Taliban that's already evaporated, but he knows that declaring victory there could give him a boost in the polls and make him look stronger on national defense. So this is a core issue to watch that I think was off the radar in most of tonight's coverage, but is going to be really essential, especially in trying to vie for independence.
Yeah, Paul, it's a great summation, and we could probably spend more time going through some of this. I want to bring in General Clark on that subject, in the matter of withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan and this deal with the Taliban. I wanted to get your reaction to what we've seen so far in terms of the agreement that was signed last week, and also your thought on what Paul is saying about how Democrats have struggled for the most part over the last several decades to go on offense on these national security issues. Do you think that President Trump presents an opportunity for them to do so, perhaps with Biden as the nominee?
Yeah, well, on Afghanistan, I think we should have been out a long time ago. And I think Joe Biden had it right in 2009. We should have gone in just for an anti-terrorist mission. I testified. I supported the surge with the proviso we would do something about the border with Pakistan. You cannot win an insurgency if you cannot isolate the theater of operations. We couldn't isolate Vietnam. We couldn't isolate Iraq. We couldn't isolate Afghanistan. And in all cases, it was a bad outcome. And so that's the first thing. And is there going to be a peace agreement with the Taliban? There's going to be a withdrawal, hopefully. And we just don't have the will, and it's not in our priorities to put a couple of million men in and another $1 trillion or $2 billion into Afghanistan to try to educate everybody, break the tribal system, separate them, protect them from Indian influences, Pakistani influences, Iranian influences, Chinese influences, and make them the 51st state. It's just not going to happen. And it's just time to realize it. if I were president, I just wouldn't be able to go to a family and say, your son was killed or daughter was killed in Afghanistan, and it was so essential for the United States. I don't believe that. We've got to get out of there. And I think that's what the majority of the American public believe. I know it's hard for the military. Look, it's very hard if you're a general officer and you're in charge of trying to win in a theater, and somebody says, well, is it time, General, to pull out? You cannot ask the generals that. What they're going to tell you is, sir, I'm going to fight for the last. You don't go to the football team in the fourth quarter and say, gentlemen, you're behind 45-0. Should we just call the game right now? Mm-hmm. No, you don't do that. And so this is a political decision, and it's a decision only a president really can make. And so.
But do you think that if you're let's say Joe Biden's the nominee and he has some credibility on national security issues, do you think, I mean, given where the American public is and the lack of will you're talking about to stay involved in some of these places, to maintain these commitments, do you think that you can successfully, if you're Joe Biden, prosecute that case?
Yes, but maybe not on
Afghanistan. His broader foreign policy.
You've got to talk about NATO. That's our future. We've got to hold Europe together. And actually, the trouble started back when we invaded Iraq. We did it without the support of our French and German allies, without NATO support. Now, some of them later came in and gave us some assistance, but they knew that was a war we didn't have to fight. And they had the courage to stand against the United States. And that's where it started to unravel. President Obama tried to put the pieces back together. He didn't have as much maneuver room. And now President Trump is taking it further and further. If he's reelected, no telling what's going to happen to NATO. So that's the first area in which President Biden, you can't handle China if you don't have allies. So it's not just about veterans. It's not just about money for the military. It's not about weapons. That's a red herring. Honestly, it's about foreign policy, national security policy, and how to keep America safe. Mm-hmm. You cannot do it without strong alliances. And that means you have to be viewed as a credible, consistent, reliable ally. And that's precisely what Donald Trump is not. He's mercurial.
Yeah,
he's
and
volatile.
this is where he's vulnerable in some areas, too. I mean, if you can do what Trump has done, Trump has weaponized the military. He's weaponized this issue that the military has his back, that they're his generals. He's used it very, very effectively. When I was out across this country in the last election, I used to talk to people of all backgrounds. I'm an independent, talking to many veterans who are independents. I said, what do you think about Hillary and Trump on veterans issues? And most often they would say, well, Trump is stronger on veterans issues. And I said, how do you know? They say, because he says it all the time. He would say it 10 times more than Hillary would say it. He would say, God bless the troops. He'd say, I'm going to fix the VA. He said, I'm going to get us out of Iraq. He didn't do most of it, but he kept saying it over and over again, and that rhetoric started to actually permeate people. So what Biden has an opportunity to do, for example, right now, is to explain that Trump is taking money from the Pentagon to build the wall. He's taking $4.8 billion, I think, from the Pentagon budget to build a couple hundred miles of the wall. Mexico's not paying for the wall. Our troops are. And if Biden can make that case, or Sanders can make that case, they can hit Trump where it hurts. They can hit him in swing states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. They can hit him with independents. They can hit him with people who are on the bubble. And it can really make a dent over time. That's why you see Mike Bloomberg weaponizing the issue. One of Mike Bloomberg's most effective ad campaigns was talking about how Trump was disrespecting the generals. Our generals and our military are still held with very high esteem. And if you disrespect them, you're disrespecting the cloth of America. And that's where Trump is vulnerable. If Biden can focus on it,
Paul,
not get
people in uniform, we can't stand the idea of Trump saying, my generals. We didn't like it in 2016 when he said, my generals, and look at his generals. They're all gone because he didn't listen to them, he didn't respect them, and because the military doesn't belong to a political party. It doesn't belong to the president. He's the commander-in-chief. But the military is an American institution, and it's a nonpartisan institution.
Well, it's going to be really interesting.
But here's our problem. Here's our problem as Democrats. Really, since the Vietnam War, we've been the party that has opposed the defense budget.
Right.
Year after year, we were against various aircraft. Don't buy so many stealth bombers. Don't modernize. Cut this weapon system. Again, and now we're in favor of people. Put more money into housing. Take more money for health care for the military. Put child care centers on military posts. Take care of veterans. But when it comes to the performance of duty, the Democrats have not bellied up to the bar on this. That's why you have to start with foreign policy, and then you have to say, and we're going to resource the armed forces to attain our foreign policy objectives. And you've got to be very firm on this. And one more thing, there are dozens and dozens of Democrats who would be great secretaries of defense. If we elect a Democratic president, I certainly hope that he doesn't say, well, Democrats, since we're going to have to deal with the Republicans, let's get a Republican Secretary of Defense. It's absolutely wrong. There's lots of Democrats who will do that job.
And that's what Obama did. I mean, Obama had Chuck Hagel as his Secretary of Defense, and then he had Bob McDonnell as his Secretary of Veterans Affairs, both Republicans. This idea that they would cede that ground to the Republicans and that they would struggle with national security,
it's a big
defense,
mistake
and
for
veterans
the party.
It is, but it's also a backyard issue in a place like Los Angeles. You've got a very high veteran homeless rate that's growing by the day. It's a deeply concerning issue for people of all political backgrounds. That's a moral issue. It's a public health issue. It's also a national security issue. And that's the kind of issue that the Democrats have an opportunity to bring home and whip back on Donald Trump. If they can do it, they can be successful in states like California and in states like Alabama. If not, they're going to get steamrolled. If you put up somebody like Bernie Sanders on national defense and try to make a case that he's going to be the commander-in-chief, you're going to get destroyed. That's a part of this discussion that I don't think that folks are really appreciating. No matter how you feel about Bernie Sanders, I don't think you can really make the case that he's going to have the trust of the American people on issues of national defense, having never served in the military, having never served on the Armed Services Committee, really having no experience internationally. When the chips are down and bullets start to fly, you need to know that that person who has their hands on the wheel can be trusted. And that extends to real-time issues like the coronavirus. If we have to deploy the National Guard, if we have to call up the reserves to deal with some of these public health issues, you need someone who's got management experience and someone who's got executive experience in national security and combat experiences.
I think Paul's
and Bernie
right.
Sanders doesn't have.
The problem is that these national security and foreign policy issues are really tough to get into the primary. They show up in the general election only if, and Democrats are on stronger grounds on the domestic issues. You know, this one's about health care and maybe education.
Right. No, I was just going to say this. We've had a more robust debate and a longer debate on some of these issues just here tonight on this live stream than you've seen in any of these primary debates. And these issues where perhaps the president is vulnerable, you have not, and perhaps these are unifying issues for Democrats, but you haven't seen them come to the fore.
But here's the weird thing about this.
You know,
here's the weird thing about this. When you're president of the United States, what do you think you have the most impact on? Foreign policy or the economy? Other than jawboning the Fed chairman that Donald Trump's trying to do and bully him a little bit and ballyhooing the stock market and telling people to invest, you really can't do much for the economy, but you do a lot in foreign policy. Look, the United States is so important in the world that other countries want to interfere in our election. What do you think the Russian interference was about? Not just to cause chaos. They did not want Hillary as the president of the United States. Putin didn't want her because he knew how tough she was. Bibi Netanyahu didn't want her because he knew she would listen to the Palestinians. And some of our Middle East friends didn't want her because she'd been part of the Iranian initiative to try to bring Iran in from the cold. And so if you look at this, the American presidency is so powerful in the world that foreign nations want in on this. This is one of the real things that we've got to talk about in national security, and that is how do we maintain the sanctity of the American election system? It's a real problem for us coming up right now.
Yeah, General Clark. Paul, we got to wrap, but I want to give you a final thought here.
Hey, look, I just think it's important to remember that even on Super Tuesday, the Russians are attacking our election. And I don't say meddling, I say attacking. I consider it an act of war. Right now, they're trying to disrupt this thing that everybody's got their eyes on. And at this very moment, we've got California's sons and daughters in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in countries around the world in active combat. That brings it home, I think, in a really important way to remember that tomorrow morning, when everybody's looking to see the final results in California, there are other California families that are watching to see how their sons and daughters, husbands and wives are doing overseas. That brings it home. And if you can capture that spirit of America, you can show that you can be trusted with America's sons and daughters in those most critical issues, then you're qualified to be commander-in-chief, and you'll get people of all political backgrounds.
Paul Reichoff with Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and General Wesley Clark, thank you so much for being here and for this really enlightening and important discussion that we've been having. It's our pleasure. And Paul, thank you for staying up late.
Guys.
I know it's late on the East Coast, but really appreciate you being with us.
No problem. It's even later in Afghanistan, so I don't mind staying up.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Well, switching gears now, anybody who lives in LA has had his or her mailbox stuffed during recent weeks with pamphlets promoting various candidates for local office. In this age of social media, you might wonder why pamphlets are still so ubiquitous in LA politics. Ara Vasquez, candidate for District 10 City Council, tells the LA Times video team that she uses pamphlets because her campaign can't possibly knock on every prospective voter's door.
I'm Aura Vasquez and I'm running for Los Angeles City Council District 10.
Mr. Wunsell, he's not home, so we need a little flyer for him here behind. Very important that they get to see my name and my face, you know, because a lot of people also throw them away.
Just as a voter myself, getting all the mailers always felt very excessive.
In my view, it's like thinking that the best answer to the plague is to have a religious procession where you get thousands of people all together and they march to a church. More people are going to get sick. Now, do mailers do harm? No. Do they do a lot of good? No. They're effective unless they meet what I call the garbage pail test. Between the time you pick them up at the mailbox and walk into your kitchen or someplace else and throw them away, they have to have conveyed a message. But you have this problem that if you're running for state assembly, you can't afford to buy television. You probably can't afford to buy much radio. So we have mailers.
In this district, in District 10, we have 141,000 voters. So it's a lot of people to walk and knock on their door, even though that's much of my, my campaign is much about meeting voters and talking to them. But soon I realized that in order to reach every voter with your message, you really need to send them mailers. Since I started sending my mailers, I have got some emails back of people saying, I already voted for you, please take me off your list so that I can reduce my carbon footprint. I even got a letter. Please help me reduce my carbon footprint, removing me from your direct mailing list. It's really great, and my hope is that eventually we get to a point where we don't need to utilize so much mailers.
Well, there may be a lot of people who are wondering when that point will come and whether or not Ms. Vasquez is actually winning her race tonight. We're in the bottom of the 9 p.m. hour here, and it's time to head back to Ben Welsh at the LA Times data desk. Ben, we need to know what's happening in that race, but also more broadly, what you're seeing in the results that are coming in from across California and beyond.
All right, Eli, let's catch up. So if we look at Ara Vasquez's race, which is for the LA City Council, we can see that the early results do not look great for her. With the small amount of ballots that have been counted so far, she is in third place with 16% of the vote, and two of her competitors sitting well ahead of her, Grace Yu at 34%, and Mark Ridley Thomas, the former member of the LA County Board of Supervisors, in first place. And so she has some catching up to do in the ballots that remain if she hopes to stay alive in this race. Let's look at some other local races while we're here. Mark Ridley Thomas is a career politician who's had many different positions in both city and state government, and he's again on the ballot. There are others as well. Kevin De Leon, former head of the Democratic caucus in the state Senate, is running for the downtown city council seat, and he is doing great in the results so far. He has 53% of the vote and has a very large lead over the competition, with the nearest competitor, Cindy Otteson, at 18%. Moving over to the open Board of Supervisors seat, which was once held by Mark Ridley Thomas and is now vacant. There are several politicians who've held other offices vying for this seat representing South LA and other parts of the county. And you can see in the early results, Holly Mitchell, a former state senator, is in the lead with 28% of the vote, narrowly ahead of Herb Wesson, who was the head of the city council prior to running for this seat. In third is Jan Perry, also a former member of the LA City Council. So in this closely contested race, it is neck and neck between Holly Mitchell and Herb Wesson so far. The LA County race that's probably most watched tonight is Jackie Lacey's run to be reelected as the county district attorney. She is facing a serious competitor in George Gascon, former officer in the LAPD and the San Francisco Police Department, who so far is far behind Lacey with only 22% of the vote compared to her 54%. Now, again, I would caution that all these results are early in the night with only a fraction of the ballots being counted, and we'll have to keep an eye on them really until the sun comes up to find out who's on top, but that's where we are so far.
I mean, just looking at the green bar graph there, you know, it looks like DA Lacey's on her way to win, that the anti-Lacey vote is sort of evenly split. Can you, I don't know if you said, did you say how much of the vote has actually been counted at this point? Are we close to a call on that race?
Unfortunately, we actually don't know how much has been counted. That information has not been relayed by the LA County Registrar Recorder. This is one of the hiccups in the introduction of the new voting system this year.
Well, we will just sort of stay on the edge of our seats and hope for more information soon. Ben, thanks very much at the data desk. Want to talk to a few journalists here at the Times now who have traveled the state over the past few weeks. You've probably seen some of their great stories in the paper. They've looked at various parts of the Democratic electorate in California. It's a huge state and a diverse electorate, and the stories show there are a lot of different kinds of Democrats in California, and how they vote has a lot to do with who they are, obviously, and where they live. The differences among these voters show that voters in California can't be put in a box, and candidates who assume that voters in the state are all alike do so at their peril. Joining us now are the LA Times' Maria Laganga, who's written a great piece about the many shades of blue in San Francisco, Haley Branson-Potts, who wrote about Placer County, north of Sacramento. Used to drive through it on my way to Tahoe. And also, we have Sarah Parvini here, who wrote about the Iranian-American community, specifically in Los Angeles. It's great to have all of you here. What did you find? I mean, you know, you watch the debates and you see things stereotyped, like, you know, wine caves and, you know, the folks in Northern California and Southern California are just. What did you find when it comes to the diversity among Democrats, you know, in Northern California, Southern California? What is driving? Are there any patterns, or is everybody kind of, you know, on their own program?
I mean, I think that what you see in, for example, in San Francisco, which is the bluest place in a very blue state, you see a lot of gradations, and you see a lot of people falling out on things like, you know, age is one big predictor. Finances are another big predictor. When you have like income inequality, which is the biggest issue in San Francisco, with housing prices through the roof and people having to commute a very long way. So those are some of the things that help decide people. But one of the other things is it's really interesting. It's a very, even though it's incredibly blue, there are lots of gradations. There are the cannabis Democrats, the Brownie Mary Democratic Club, who really care about whether a candidate is for legalization. Then you have the various LGBTQ groups. There's the Alice B. Toklas one, which is the conservatives ones, and then there's the Harvey Milk, and they're the more progressive ones. So what you saw there is a lot of emphasis on Bernie, but you also see things like Art Agnos, who's believed to be the very last really progressive mayor there. He's a Bloomberg guy. I spoke with a lovely 74-year-old transgender woman who basically volunteers for every lefty thing in the universe. But she also points out she's a devout Lutheran. She has symphony season tickets, and her portfolio is doing really well. She likes Bloomberg too.
People are complicated.
So complicated.
When you were up the road, you know, on the road to Tahoe there, that is not, that is a little red island in this very blue state. What does this primary look like there? When, you know, it's all we're hearing about nationally, it's all people are talking about in LA. It's probably not, you know, the big focus in Placer County.
Not as much there. That area looks much more like the middle of the country, like where I'm from in Oklahoma. It is reliably red. The county itself has voted for a Republican presidential candidate every election since 1980. So there, the primary was not as big of a focus. There, the Democratic Party is, it's much more, they feel like underdogs. There's a sense of desperation. There's a real desire to get young voters to come out just to build their numbers. It's a place where the Democratic vote is so small that they used to have bumper stickers that said "just another Placer County Democrat." So there, it's very much an older group of people, and they're desperate for basically to revive the party there.
Some of the people in your reporting you wrote about who are more open to Democratic candidates were much younger people. They were starting environmental clubs in their schools, right. And you know, is that sort of, I mean, in terms of what the Democratic voter looks like there, I mean, are there opportunity? Are there certain issues? Is climate change an issue where those folks think like, hey, I can, draw some attention to this? Because I would imagine a community like that, given your sort of social, the social pressures from being in a community that's largely Republican, it may be difficult for people to stick their necks out and say, I don't agree with that. Are there issues that you found that are maybe a little easier for people to latch onto that might be, might give us an idea of what a Democratic candidate trying to appeal to those voters might want to emphasize?
Sure. Well, I mean, by all counts, the Democratic message for young people there and widely all over the country would appeal more to young people. I mean, issues like climate change, student loan debt, these kept coming up over and over again. And the young people there kept telling me they're issues voters. They're not blue no matter who, is what one of them told me. The problem in a place like that is you have brain drain. So once these students turn 18, they'll often cross the county line and they'll move away. They're not voters in the county for long. So that's been part of the problem, is they have to keep recruiting young people who keep moving away. So the county itself is actually, if you look at the age breakdown, it's actually older than the rest of the state, because there aren't as many opportunities. And so the young people who do stay are desperately trying to organize themselves. They actually have tried several times to have a Placer County young Democratic club, and as one of them told me, it flopped. So it's kind of constant churn is what they're looking at.
Sarah Parvini, when you went into the Iranian American community in Los Angeles, you found not a monolithic group, but a diverse group of people who have various reasons for supporting different candidates. They're not all with Bernie, but a lot of them seem to be.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that like any ethnic community in Los Angeles or across the country, the Iranian American electorate is not a monolith, like you said. You certainly have people who support Bernie Sanders, and I went up to Oakland and they even had a forum in Bernie Sanders' Oakland campaign office, Iranians for Bernie. And then here in Southern California, you've got people who support someone who's more like Joe Biden. You've got, of course, Bernie supporters, but you've also got sort of a conservative contingent as well who support President Trump. And so I think what you would find is that based on people's lived experiences, based on perhaps when they immigrated to the United States or whether they were born here, you'll find these different kinds of fissures to divide the community.
How does that break down? Because this is a presidency that has really engaged directly with Iran and has a very clear position on the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama and the other countries put in place in 2015. President Trump ripped that up. And it sounds like there are some Iranian Americans who are happy that he ripped it up, and there are others who, are there clear lines in terms of age or perhaps affluence? Are there other what sort of did you find maybe helped separate some of these people within that community into sort of more hardline pro-Trump positions and more Bernie Sanders type positions?
So there are a lot of things. There are things like your socioeconomic status, which I think is, again, true for a lot of the country, regardless of what your ethnic background is. But, among the Iranian American community, what a lot of people were telling me is that they also see a big generational gap, where the younger people who either were born here or who came as children, so they count as, 1.5 generation, they might be leaning toward a more liberal candidate, a candidate who would be willing to have some sort of diplomacy with Iran, whether that's Obama style or, whatever a Sanders might do, But then again, if you're older, that doesn't mean that you automatically support Trump. That's certainly not true. But the more conservative people who I have met who are Iranian tend to be older.
Do you think, this question we've been talking tonight about how it looks pretty clear at this point that the Democratic nominee will be either Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. I'm going to ask you each this question, but in terms of, we'll start with the Iranian American community. I know we've said these are not monolithic groups. We don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. Do you think that one or the other has a better shot at turning out those communities, drawing support from that community? I mean, do you think Bernie Sanders is in a better position than Joe Biden to pull support from that community?
It's a good question. Certainly, it seemed like just from what I saw on the ground, among the younger Iranian American voters, there were people who were millennials or maybe even Gen X who were very energized about supporting Sanders. However, if you look back at January, it didn't get too much news, but Biden had a fundraising event at a very prominent Iranian entrepreneur's home in Orange County. And while that was not geared necessarily just toward the Iranian American community, and it had people from all over present, that leads me to believe that certainly there are more moderate Iranian Americans who would throw their weight behind Biden.
Haley, I mean, same question. Do you think that a guy like Bernie Sanders has any prayer pulling votes? I know it's a small community. It's not going to maybe change that much in the bigger picture. But in terms of making those inroads, we saw, Pete Buttigieg and other states really try to be precise in going into places that are traditionally Republican counties and saying, I can get delegates out of these places if I talk to these people. They've never been talked to by a Democrat before. Between Biden and Bernie, I mean, do you think that Joe Biden is the one that has more of a chance to maybe get a few votes in some of those kinds of places?
Again, it's a generational divide.
Really?
There, it's very strong. The young people there were adamant that they were all big Sanders supporters. One of the young men I spoke to, he's 19, he helped found the Sierra Foothills Young Democrats Club, which stretches across 3 counties, because that's what they have to do. He said the hill I'll die on is that you don't win these areas that have been dominated by Republican candidates by being moderate. So the young people I spoke to up there, they're all going with Sanders.
Yeah.
The older folks were much more moderate. But the county party there is struggling. I mean, as Democrats are elsewhere to kind of identify itself.
Mm-hmm. And up in Northern California, I mean, it's so different, right, from this corridor to Silicon Valley and then to San Francisco and the East Bay and Marin County. I mean, it's so diverse. How do you see this? Ultimately, California is going to go in the blue column on election night.
No matter what
it doesn't really matter. The popular vote doesn't really matter. But in terms of who has maybe more of an emotional connection with California voters, do you see all the same Bernie voters turning out for Joe Biden, vice versa? Do you see that this choice tells us much about where California voters are now that Bernie Sanders just won the state's primary?
That's a really good question. And I mean, when you look at, for example, in Northern California, there was almost no one there working on Biden's behalf. Right. Bernie was completely organized. That area, San Francisco County, is the most Democratic in the entire state. It is the least Republican in the entire state, and it has the highest percentage of no party preference. Those folks there care about healthcare. It's a real big deal. Housing, a real big deal. But when you look at the folks on the ground, the Bernie ones are incredibly organized and incredibly energetic. And I went to a canvassing event, and there was one woman who was old enough that she was a red diaper baby. And then there were people who were voting for the first time. One of the things that Haley always tells me as we sit there and talk about this at work is that the young people might adore Bernie Sanders, but, would you like to say it?
Young people don't vote.
Young people don't vote.
So discouraging, but also reality-based.
Consistently. I mean, based on the data we looked at, voters ages 18 to 24 consistently vote at a rate 20% lower than the rest of the population. So excitement, will that translate to votes? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, and it's true. This is one of the things that Bernie Sanders has said. I can expand the electorate. I can excite people. You need enthusiasm. We have not seen the electorate, really expand in any of these early states.
Not at all.
Especially not the ones that he has won. And your point is really interesting about Joe Biden, the lack of organization. I mean, he's run a campaign. We all scratched our heads. We saw him basically sort of throw his hat out there, not bother with organization. He's not real good in the debates. His whole strategy was kind of like, I'm Joe Biden, you know me. And it didn't seem like it was working until it was working.
And it really worked.
Yeah.
Tonight we're seeing it's working in ways that are incredibly surprising.
This is a great discussion, and I really appreciate all of you staying up late and coming down here and chatting about your reporting, because it's great reporting. It's worth paying for if you don't already have an LA Times digital subscription. But I've enjoyed reading it. It gets me smarter, because when you're in that DC bubble and you're just Trump, Trump, Trump all the time, you can learn a few things if you read other parts of our coverage. So I thank you for your work and for staying up late with us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you all. This is the first time California has moved its primary from June all the way up to March. This election was also the first time for thousands of 18-year-old voters who headed to the polls to cast their vote. Our LA Times video team caught up with new voters at Grover Cleveland Charter High School in Reseda to find out what they care about most in this election.
How does it feel to be voting for the first time?
I've been looking forward to this when I turn 18. Like, I just wanted to vote because I get to make a difference and I get to have a say.
I am so excited to be voting. In social media, with everything that's going on today, it's almost impossible to not hear about political events. So to be able to hear about all that but not be able to actually vote has been kind of frustrating for me. So I'm absolutely excited to be able to vote in the presidential election.
Turning 18 for me has made me feel more mature in a way, even though I still feel like a kid kind of, but I'm just happy to vote in this primary along with the election, because I feel like my vote does matter. The 2020 election is a very important one in U.S. history.
I'm not 18 yet, but I will be 18 by the presidential election, and honestly, it feels really rewarding to be able to vote because I feel like I've done a lot of research in terms of this election, and I'm really excited to be an educated voter.
It's so easy to just give up when things start getting hard. And I really hope that my generation and the first-time voters this year won't do that this year, that they'll actually put in the work and see that, no, I can do something. It might not change everything immediately, but I can do something.
It's good perspective. We just said young people don't vote, but there's a few who are, and hopefully they'll keep it up. After nearly 4 decades of being represented by one family, voters in California's 50th congressional district will pick a new legislator following the criminal conviction of Congressman Duncan D. Hunter. The 50th congressional district encompasses parts of eastern and east central San Diego County and part of Riverside County. Joining us now by phone is San Diego Union Tribune politics reporter Charles Clark. Charles, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Let's give viewers a little bit of background here. The Hunter family, if you're not familiar, the legacy, well, it ended with a corruption conviction and resignation in January of Congressman Duncan D. Hunter, who had replaced his father in Congress in 2009. On the day of Hunter's guilty plea, prosecutors called this case against him a triumph for the press. They said they started investigating Hunter after a series of stories by your colleague Morgan Cook more than 3 years ago. Bring us up to speed.
Right. So, it all started with a story Morgan did that kind of prompted, the U.S. Attorney's interest, as well as kind of, I think, deepened the FEC's interest in the matter. But since then, and everything that went down with Duncan, it really just set off a Republican bloodbath. This is kind of the last solid Republican seat in San Diego County, and it certainly brought out a few heavy hitters hoping to capture it.
Give us a sense of who those heavy hitters are, just real quick.
Yeah. So quickly, there's former Rep. Darrell Issa, who not only is a local name, but nationally pretty well known from his days on House Oversight, where he prided himself on being the chief antagonist of the Obama administration.
Right.
And then you also have conservative radio host Carl DeMaio, who's also known for some of his statewide campaigns, such as repeal of the gas tax efforts.
And is there a front runner tonight? I mean, we know this is traditionally a Republican stronghold, but is Issa the front runner just based on name ID? I mean, what's your sense of how this is going?
I think, so I guess the definitive front runner is Lamar Campanajjar, right? The lone Democrat in the field, who ran against Hunter in 2018 when he was a relative unknown, came just shy of 3 points of winning the seat. As the lone Democrat, he's assured of advancing, it looks like, especially based on the early returns. As far as the front-runner status, we don't really know. Polling has always been real neck and neck between Issa and DeMaio. And although the early returns gave about a 3-point lead to Issa, you certainly don't see anyone sounding victory yet. And I think the expectation, if the campaigns are being real honest, is that this is going to be one of those counts that takes not only the night, but probably a couple of days.
So the primary night, Democrat looks good. What about in November? Is there any chance of flipping this seat, or is the Republican that advances likely going to be the one who comes out ahead?
Right. So most political observers, they note, just given the bend of the district, that, hey, if you trot out a Republican who doesn't have the baggage of, say, a Duncan Hunter, they would presumably be the favorite. With that being said, Mark Campanajjar, as much as he benefited from Duncan's predicament, he did mount a pretty darn impressive campaign with virtually no help from the DNC, and pretty much just, an unknown. I used to joke he and kind of his small campaign staff were like the Scooby Gang, just kind of going around from event to event. And now he really is, running with that name ID. He's also, well known as a very moderate Democrat. I'm sure there's some people, especially on the progressive wing, who hear him and would say just, 5-10 years ago, he probably would have been more of a Republican. But he really does a pretty good job of connecting with voters when he meets them, and I've actually even seen him personally sway some traditionally Republican voters just in that face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, and the retail politics obviously matters, but the numbers are generally pretty telling. But, in the Trump era, I mean, we have seen districts that are R plus 10, plus 12, and all over the country really wind up electing Democrats. What are the voter registration numbers in this district in terms of how big is that Republican advantage? Is it something Democrats you think can overcome?
On its face, I would say no. And I think most people, they don't think they can either. It's pretty sizable. I think just the thing that probably sets it apart here is you have a non-traditional Democrat who also hasn't really gone the traditional path of, bashing Trump. I know much to the chagrin of some of the progressives out here. He's really walked a fine line when it's come to the president, as well as, some of the hot button cases, like the case of former Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher. And I think that gives him some wiggle room. And also the thing to keep in mind that I think kind of is understated just in this race is that both DeMaio and Issa, regardless of who advanced, neither of them is actually of the district, right? And East County and Inland North County really does have a sense of identity in place, and there is something to be said for someone like Campanajjar, who is of the district, grew up there, and decided to mount the second bid. I think there's a lot of people who give him quite a bit of credit from that cross-party line. So that probably puts him in play. Plus, just given how well he did last time based on the sheer numbers, they already suggest that he's able to sway, if not flip, independents and some of the Republicans in the district.
It is interesting. It does sometimes come down to the actual candidate, whether they're known, what kind of campaign they're running. And it's interesting, especially given the high profile of the incumbent in this seat. We really appreciate Charles Clark with our sister newspaper, the San Diego Union-Tribune, politics reporter there covering this heated congressional race in San Diego. Charles, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yep, thank you. And thanks as well to everybody who's still with us on this live stream. We will be right back in 60 seconds.
The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
And welcome back to Pulse of the Nation. California Decides, a special LA Times live stream from our El Segundo studios. I'm Eli Stokols with you. It is just after 10 p.m. on the West Coast, which means it's late in Washington, D.C. And we have some big results to give you tonight. Bernie Sanders, here's the top line, winning the California primary. But don't get too excited just yet, because it's going to be a little while before the full vote is counted and we know exactly how many of the state's 415 delegates Senator Sanders is going to be taking with him to the convention in Milwaukee in July. Senator Biden not looking great in the early returns, but closing strong, and based on the results that we've seen in so many other Super Tuesday states, really steamrolling across the South and other parts of the country and consolidating this down to a two-person race at this point, we may see him finish strong and narrow that gap with Senator Biden here in California. Just to update you here, since we're just past the top of the hour, on where we're at on Super Tuesday right now. Some very early calls across the Eastern time zone, some of these Super Tuesday states, for former Vice President Biden, who really didn't spend a whole lot of money or time in a lot of these states, places like Virginia, North Carolina. They were early calls for him tonight, really a function of the momentum that he has suddenly acquired after winning so handily in South Carolina, getting Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar out of the race. And he is taking that momentum with him. You see a lot of voters in these states who were clamoring for someone to consolidate maybe the anti-Bernie side of the field, the not Bernie side of the field. They waited and they found their guy. They got the message in a lot of these states. Biden winning in Alabama, Arkansas, Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar's home state, North Carolina, as I mentioned, Oklahoma, Tennessee. Senator Sanders piling up a couple wins. You see, obviously, California in purple on that map. Also Utah, Colorado, that's a key swing state come November, and also his home state of Vermont. So that's the map. No wins for Elizabeth Warren tonight. Again, she is a senator from Massachusetts, and you see the Bay State colored in green right there. Joe Biden winning Senator Warren's state. She may not be long for this race. And Mike Bloomberg, the former New York City mayor, he does have a win tonight of sorts. He won American Samoa, so that's something. But that is probably not going to that is probably not what he was looking for when he decided to spend $500 million on his campaign with an eye on Super Tuesday. Senator Biden really consolidating that not Bernie lane and picking off all those voters for the most part who might have been open to Bloomberg had Biden looked weaker and susceptible to Bloomberg's TV ads. He spent $18 million in Virginia, didn't win it. Biden spent $360,000 and won it going away. So some interesting stuff in the results tonight. We'll keep an eye on it. But we want to switch gears now. One of the most pressing social problems in California was all but ignored by the candidates fighting for the Democratic vote here. We're talking about how to solve the homelessness problem that so many cities are grappling with up and down the Golden State and really across the country. Liam Dillon covers housing and homelessness for the Times, and he joins us now. What, we've seen the president make an issue of homelessness in Los Angeles. We've seen the mayor's office here extend a hand to Washington to say, hey, we're ready. There's been some conversations we report on. My colleague Noah Bierman, I think, has worked with you and Ben and some other folks here trying to figure out what, if anything, is happening. What is happening, and why do you think such an important issue for voters in this city, in this important state, was really just not a subject of much conversation leading into Super Tuesday?
Yeah, so there was a lot of emphasis among the Democratic candidates, I think, around on housing plans, much more so than they had been in the past. That being said, not a ton specifically as it relates to homelessness. You know, we did see the president coming out, as you mentioned, repeatedly referring to things like we need to bring more law and order, or all these sorts of ideas that were kind of very vague, and many of the folks in the political establishment here thought were counterproductive. There are, however, conversations that are ongoing between the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, and the mayor of Los Angeles, but some sort of potential solution that could refer to potentially opening up some federal lands, both for homeless shelters and for homeless housing, but that has not come to fruition as of yet.
So why is this, I mean, you know, I cover the president every day, and a lot of times when he says things, because it's so hyperbolic sometimes, we'll listen to it and you'll just be like, okay, that's not true.
Right.
But there is a problem in Los Angeles with homelessness, right? He may exaggerate it, he may be politicizing it, but there is an issue in a lot of cities, and he may point to the ones on the West Coast because he wants to, dump on politicians in California and perpetuate this idea that big city Democrats don't know what they're doing. But there is a problem. How did it get to this point? What, maybe that's a book, not a not an answer on a panel here.
Yeah.
But what's the short version of how we got to this point?
So I think underlying all of this is the fact that rents have risen so dramatically in California over the past decade coming out of the economic recession. And obviously, when rents go up, that means fewer people can afford to pay for their housing. And that is, certainly leading to some of the dramatic increases that we're seeing up and down the state. You mentioned Los Angeles, but a lot of other areas. Alameda County, where Oakland is, had a over 40% increase in the past 2 years, just gigantic numbers. And in fact, it's gotten so bad in California that the increase in California over the past year outweighed the decrease that would have been in place for the rest of the country. So in essence, because homeless population in California grew so much, that meant the homeless population in the entire country grew as well.
What is obviously there's a human incentive to handling this and a quality of life incentive for obviously the people who are living on the streets and other people who live in the city. But is there a political incentive to fix this, right? We talk in Washington about how with immigration, sometimes it seems like both sides don't want to solve that problem.
Right.
It's not to sort of, draw a false balance or anything. It's just to say that some sides seem to like having that issue and to beat that drum. Homelessness, it's not the same kind of emotional issue for folks, but has the administration shown that it's actually serious about working with Democratic leaders in California? Is there a will? Can our political system really address this at this point?
Let me address the politics of it first. I think that you're right. LA Mayor Eric Garcetti was very much considering a presidential run. But I think one thing that really held him back was the idea that you were going to see immediately, if he gained any traction, ads of the horrific conditions on Skid Row, and that would immediately sort of end any momentum that he would have. I think the governor, Gavin Newsom, is certainly attuned to this being a huge political issue for him. He may have eyes on higher office, but if you again show conditions at Skid Row, show conditions in his native San Francisco, these are things that are not going to play well with voters, and rightfully so, because this human misery on the streets is really a stain, I think, on the state being the sort of bastion of showing how progressive ideals can sort of win the day, right? If you have such a progressive state, but you have over 150,000 people homeless, there's a real disconnect there.
And in terms of plans, right, we're seeing tonight in the results, right, Elizabeth Warren, Plan for Everything, still hasn't won a state. Pete Buttigieg, very thoughtful, out of the race. Right. Joe Biden has not put out a real comprehensive housing plan.
He did in the last week, but he was among the latest people to do so.
Right, and so there's in terms of what this looks like going forward, do you think there's any, if you're just evaluating the various housing plans, Senator Sanders, Vice President Biden, what's the main difference? If this is an issue that people really want to drill down on, what are the sort of differences here?
There are a lot of them, but I think it probably the main one comes down to rent control. Senator Sanders is calling for a national rent control policy, the only Democratic candidate who was doing so. Joe Biden's plan very much relies on beefing up the Section 8 program, which is the housing vouchers given to low-income residents. He wants to sort of significantly increase funding for that. But the rent control is really the big issue. We've had a bunch of rent control battles in California, potentially another one on the ballot in November. And Senator Sanders has been supportive of those prior efforts, supportive of the one here in November, and is the only candidate, as I said, who's proposing a similar measure nationwide.
Do you think this is something that, if one of these guys is elected, do you think that this is something that will come from Washington, or do you think that this is something that the state and the city are just going to have to find a way to address on their own?
I think all the Democratic candidates have talked a lot about beefing up the federal government's role in housing, whether it's money, whether it's policy, or some combination thereof. Certainly more so than the Trump administration. While there's been doing a lot of bashing of California for its housing and homelessness problems, he's proposed to cutting HUD budget. So there's not a lot of help on the way. No matter what the president may be saying about homelessness in California, not a lot of help on the way in that administration. I think it's certainly reasonable to expect there would be more funding, emphasis, and interest if a Democrat were in office.
It is not something that we have heard a ton about, but you have heard about it if you have been reading the LA Times. And I thank you for your coverage and for being here tonight. It's an interesting discussion and obviously a really important issue here. Salient to people's lives. So we'll keep reading and we'll see what happens, as the president often says.
Thanks,
Liam Dillon, thanks very much for being here. Well, and thanks for all of you for being with us on this live stream. We're going to come back in just 1 minute with more election results and analysis. Stick with us.
The search to solve our most pressing issues. How to endure, and how to be redeemed. The world is watching California, because California fights back, remembers where we're from, and defies those in our way. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Democratic socialism, and I think we should put a proven winner in charge.
If I'm elected and I'm coming for you, and gun manufacturers, I'm going to take you on.
People want a chance to hear women have an opportunity to speak.
If I'm president of the United States, you're not going to interfere in any more.
What a wonderful country we have. The best-known socialist in the country happens to be a millionaire with 3 houses.
And here's the deal. We ought to start rewarding work, not just wealth.
Hey, welcome back to Pulse of the Nation. California Decides, a special live stream from the LA Times. I'm Eli Stokols. We are living in one of the most divisive times in this country's history, at least it feels that way at the moment. And you can glimpse a different attitude and different opinions that divide us, but also bring us together sometimes by traveling, getting out of your comfort zone, speaking to residents who live in different places. One of those places along California State Route 33. Tyrone Beeson is a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. You probably saw him if you were watching at 8 o'clock. He's been covering the presidential election, and he is back with us for LA Times Super Tuesday After Dark, or Way After Dark. Thanks for being here, hour number 3.
Nice to be back.
So this is your piece. They printed out, I think they printed out with like a little larger font. Maybe that's a commentary on my age.
No, it's book length.
But this is a thick story, and a lot of great reporting in here in terms of what people are really feeling out there. Tell us about just, this road trip and how you came up with this idea to drive these 300 miles up sort of the spine of the state.
Well, I'm a newcomer to California, so it's part of my effort to get to know the state. And because I'm a political reporter, I wanted to do a political road trip, so I thought I would combine the two. It's a classic sort of Route 66 style road trip, but in the 21st century on Route 33. And I wanted to find out what was different about that part of California, because I live in downtown LA. And so some of the issues that you've been talking about tonight, income inequality, homelessness, those things are right outside my doorstep. I wanted to understand how people in other parts of California related to issues around the economy, climate change, regulations and taxes. And so this trip gave me an opportunity to visit rural communities where farming and oil drilling and so on are the main sort of job creators. And because of that, their political outlook is quite different. And there's a line in the story that I want to mention. I talk about how in the big city, people are quite densely packed. Right. There, people measure their acreage in tens of thousands of acres. I mean, it's a very different relationship to the land itself and to California.
Well, and you saw the map on the screen a moment ago about where we're talking about here. And this is not a place that, most people, right? California on the electoral map, it's a foregone conclusion that it's a blue state. It's just not places where I think people are used to seeing politicians come really ask them for their vote or ask them what. Now, what do they say to you when you showed up? Were they surprised to see you?
I'll say that a lot of people rolled their eyes. The idea that the liberal media, the fake news, or whatever it was coming to their town to find out how they lived and what they thought about politics kind of amused some folks. So some of it was a trust-building exercise as a journalist. Sure. A lot of these folks live in counties that went for Trump. Some were more middle of the road. You might expect that somewhere in the Midwest. Even some of these places even look like where I grew up in the South. Rolling pastures, fields full of cows, the whole thing. So people were a little bit skeptical about the idea, but once I kind of sat down with them and asked them, tell me about your life, tell me about the country, what do you want it to be and how do you relate to it? Then these wonderful anecdotes opened up and people talked about the stake that they have in a state that we, on this side of the mountains and on this side of the highway, seem to take for granted as well. And it was really interesting. I mean, people care about the environment and job creation and helping the middle class and jobs. But in a part of the state where there are prisons and oil fields and orchards, they're going to come at that in a very different way.
What did they say about sort of economic concerns? And right, these are places where there's just not the, economy that there is in downtown Los Angeles or in a
Right.
big city. The options are fewer. There's fewer jobs. A lot of people probably, graduate high school. Some people probably leave. What do they say about the economic situation for people who want to stay, who are tied to that land and those places?
I will tell you, I've taken a couple of trips to this part of the state. People feel as if the state government is a little bit too overbearing. Taxes, regulations, and what have you. And you can argue about the validity of that, but people really do believe that that if the state would get off of its back and the federal government would get off of their backs, that they live out their lives a little bit more fully and more happily. There aren't that many options. You're right. I visited, this wasn't in the story, but I actually visited a lettuce field and talked to mostly Latino farm workers who are making not even minimum wage in some cases. But what these folks said to me was that they use that as a springboard to something else. People there have hopes and dreams just as we do here in LA or in San Francisco or in San Diego. But how to get to those dreams is different. And Route 33 is just another avenue just to extend the metaphor to reaching that. I met a woman who was working in the field picking lettuce to put herself through nursing school. And so, again, the American dream is there. It just looks a little bit different, and there's a different pathway. And so the road is a metaphor for that as well.
Are there politicians that, I know every person is different, but are there politicians who some of these people that you met feel like are speaking to them?
I didn't meet a lot of that. I certainly in the Trump areas, people were supportive of the president. What was surprising to me in a state that's perceived as quite progressive, I didn't have a single conversation with anyone about Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren. It's not that they're not paying attention, but when I asked people to talk to me about their politics and about the country, it was more unifying themes than that. They certainly want the middle class to be restored. They certainly want the working class to get help and for the poor and the homeless to get a leg up. But it wasn't a conversation about candidates and policies. It was really about the bigger themes about let's save the country and then we'll worry about the particulars later. It was really interesting.
I'm looking at your piece, and I'm reading again about Julia Medina.
Yeah.
62-year-old woman. You describe her in a dwelling that is a container the size of a walk-in closet that was designed to transport produce, and now held her clothes, cookware, and a small bed where her dogs played. And she says she doesn't know how to live anywhere else. I would, if you're just, this is home for you, and the opportunities are few and far between. What do people like her want beyond, regulation being rolled back and things that might help businesses? Are there other things that they want, or have they kind of given up on government generally?
I think a lot of these folks feel as if voting won't make a difference one way or the other. But I tell you what, they want a lot in terms of their stake in America and their stake in California. And what's interesting about Julia and why I wanted to include her in this piece, when she said that to me, it kind of broke my heart in a way. I mean, I came from a small town in Kentucky. Now, I ran away to the West Coast, right, for opportunity, but a lot of folks stayed. I heard people saying that in South Carolina last week. People in Iowa, where I was a couple of weeks ago, also said that. These small towns where people want to stay, where young people don't want to run away. There's family connections, there's church connections, there's a connection to the land. She told me that when she was a young woman, she picked tomatoes for a living. And this land, to wax romantic, is her land too. Mm-hmm. It's just that she lives in a container. And so it was so heartbreaking because I didn't quite know how to put that in the story, but that idea of taking policy, income inequality, homelessness, whatever it is, and understanding that there's an emotion there. There's a connection that everyone wants to have across economic lines to this state. And so again, that was the thing that sort of unified these disparate realities along Route 33.
Well, and I think, we saw it in 2016, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think one of the things that surprised a lot of people, including reporters who covered that campaign about how well the president did, was underestimating or not fully appreciating how much he spoke to people who felt like they had been ignored.
And that is very much the case in California, just as it is in the Rust Belt and in some cases in the South. The idea that they're being ignored by the institutions of government and by politicians. Trump speaks to those folks in one way, in Trump's part of California. There are parts of this route where he did not win in 2016, sure, of course, and they want someone else to speak to those issues. But across the board, I think there's this real need to be heard and to be validated, and for someone, whoever the next president is, to restore people's idea that they can belong wherever they are.
Well, you know, the story is really illuminating, and as we just saw, produced some stunning images too of places that I think a lot of people have not been. A lot of our readers probably have not maybe driven this route. Maybe they've stopped in Coalinga and gotten a steak or something. But
a lot of cool pit stops actually along the way.
But not actually engaged and seeing the people.
Exactly.
Tyrone, thank you for spending this time with us and you know, bringing your reporting to even sharper relief for us here tonight, and for doing it. You know, again, it's another one of those stories that's worth the price of a subscription. So thank you for the work and for being down here, and you know, best of luck the next. How many months do we have?
I've stopped counting.
We've got a bunch, right? We've got a bunch. This is
Yes.
this is one night and it keeps going. So I'll see you out there. But thanks you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's time for another check-in with our friend Ben Welsh on the LA Times data team. Ben, we are getting toward the bottom of the 10 p.m. hour. Any new results, anything jumping out at you?
Well, the big picture remains the same. Just to recap for people who maybe just joined us, there's 14 states that voted today, and 12 of them have already been decided. 8 states have gone to former Vice President Joe Biden, and 4 to Bernie Sanders. Biden winning mostly southern states, but also Minnesota, Massachusetts, and others. And Sanders winning our state of California, Colorado, Utah, and Vermont. The 2 states that are still too close to call are Texas, which is the #2 delegate haul of the night following California, where Biden and Sanders are neck and neck with about 2/3 of the precincts reporting, and Maine, where they're also very close, but a much smaller state and less valuable in terms of delegates. In both cases, Biden holds a narrow edge. At latimes.com/Super Tuesday, you can see all of our live results throughout the night filling in. And we have pages like this one for the Texas primary, where we can look and see the results in every county so far. And this will update live as you're on the web. And we can see here that the purple Biden shows that he's winning in the large cities of Houston and Dallas so far, while Sanders is winning in Austin and San Antonio. We have the same page for California, which I think can provide a pretty good catch-up on what's been happening here at home. We have about a little more than 1/3 of the precincts are reporting, according to the state, and Bernie Sanders remains in first place with nearly 30% of the vote, which is a really large margin over the second-place finisher. Earlier, we saw Michael Bloomberg was in second, but in the time sense, Joe Biden has jumped ahead of him and now sits in second place with about 19% of the votes. We'll continue to watch this as the night goes along. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that it seems clear that Joe Biden has had a burst of support go his way in the last few days or in the last week. The votes that came in early in the night were primarily people who voted by mail or who voted well in advance of Election Day. Now, as we get later into the night, the ballots being counted are primarily people who voted today. And so it's possible that these votes will skew Biden or at least trend his way, and that's what we've seen so far. But we'll have to keep our eye on it as we go. If we scroll down and look at the California map, we can see it's almost entirely green. Green is the color for Bernie Sanders, which means that he's the leading candidate in almost every county in the state, including LA County, where he currently has about 32% of the vote, well ahead of the second-place finisher, Joe Biden. These counties, LA and the Central Valley, Route 33 that Tyrone was just talking about runs right here. These counties went for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, and so it's a significant victory for Bernie Sanders that he was able to win over these voters who didn't support him last time.
Ben, thank you for keeping us up to date on this. I have one question. Can we go back to Ben for just a second?
Yes.
I know you've been with us all night, and you've been doing a great job. I just want to ask you, the little penguin sticker on the bottom of your computer, what is that all about?
The penguin is called Tux. He is the representative of the Linux open source operating system. I am one of these strange nerds that prefers to use free software to the more luxurious products put out by the Apple Computer Company.
Gotcha. Well, I'm an Apple user, but also a Penguin guy, so it stuck out to me. Ben, thank you. We may come back to you, but if we don't, thank you so much for all the results throughout the night. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, and we are joined back on the set here by the Brain Trust, David Lauder, Washington Bureau Chief, and John Myers, the Sacramento Bureau Chief. You guys have been watching the news all night. I mean, Ben just went through the results. Bernie's going to win California, but this is not, I mean, you know, Biden ran up 50% of the vote plus in some of these other states. This is a huge delegate prize. Bernie's not getting, doesn't seem like, half the delegates in California. And you know, for Biden to go into Texas, and I mean, that's the second biggest prize on the board. Texas, 228 delegates at stake, and Biden looks like he's winning Texas.
There's a good chance that when all is said and done tonight, Joe Biden's going to end the night with more delegates than Bernie Sanders. That's a big problem for Bernie Sanders because Sanders has been saying for a couple of weeks now that whoever has the most delegates, even if it isn't a majority, should be the nominee. And right now, the person who's got more delegates seems likely to be Joe Biden.
That's a be careful what you wish for, isn't it?
It sure is.
How did that happen? I mean, this we talked about this at 8 o'clock, but is this a surprise that, I mean, I think going into tonight, right, everybody was writing the preview stories and they were saying, well, you know, Biden may pile up some wins, but Bernie's going to get more delegates, and it's because he's going to win California, and maybe he'll win Texas. Biden's going to win Texas. I mean, this is just so, you know, bigger than what we expected for Joe Biden, and it happened so quickly.
The only thing I saw here, talking to people over the last several weeks, is that this kind of makes me feel about is that, you know, this was Sanders' support that we knew existed. If we didn't know this was Biden's support, then we didn't know it because there were other candidates in the race, because they're not all institutional powers, but they're people who are more aligned in the wing of the Democratic Party that Joe Biden sits in, Pete Buttigieg sat in. They didn't know where they were going to sit. And so, if anything, I'm not surprised by it in that way because they all found the candidate they wanted with the succession of people leaving the race. That vote that Sanders is getting tonight in those early returns in California, that's, I think, exactly what we thought he was going to get. The rest of the race moved around Bernie Sanders, at least in California, it seems like to me.
But if you look at elsewhere in the country, I mean, we knew that Biden would probably do pretty well in Virginia, that he would do pretty well in North Carolina. The South Carolina vote kind of forecast that. But nobody thought that Joe Biden was going to win Massachusetts. We thought that was
certainly not Elizabeth Warren.
No, that's right. I mean, we thought that was going to be a battle between Warren and Sanders, and that Biden would be lucky to get third. So no one was predicting that. Maine was supposed to be a stronghold for Bernie Sanders, and right now it's still too close to call. And then you look at Texas. I mean, you know, I wrote this morning that state was a toss-up. So you know, we knew that there was a possibility, but the idea that that Biden would be doing as well in Texas as he's doing, and that, you know, Sanders, although he's certainly winning out here, his margin over Biden is not nearly as big as his supporters would have wanted or even would have expected a few days ago.
And can I just say, Eli, really quickly, wait for those congressional district returns to come in. And then to David's point, it's really going to be interesting to see where the Sanders universe lies, because I know we're going to see some of these other candidates, even the ones who've dropped out, getting somewhere in the range of getting delegates out of that proportional system.
Right, and the votes we're seeing now from California are heavily early vote.
Right.
So we know from the exit polls and also from what's happened elsewhere in the country that Biden did much better on Election Day. So you can expect his vote to go up as the count goes along.
I mean, the Biden folks, right, everybody else gave the Biden people a lot of grief for a long time about what's wrong with your campaign, what's wrong with you, why aren't you winning yet? They sort of had this theory of the case where just wait till South Carolina and Super Tuesday. They've been proven right. But do you think that this has almost worked out better than even they anticipated that it could have? I mean, it seems like this is like a royal flush for them, and I don't think they were banking on that.
You know, in politics, it helps to be good. It helps a whole lot more to be lucky. And they just, you know, everything has broken their way for the last 72 hours. They, you know, they got this big win in South Carolina, just at the point when voters in the party, as John was saying, people who weren't sold on Sanders were sort of casting about, trying to figure out, well, where do we go? And all of a sudden, they all go this way. I mean, Biden still has a lot of problems. He's got weaknesses as a candidate. He's not a great fundraiser. He's not the most dynamic personality on the stump. But he's been able to make up for those weaknesses by being empathetic and by being lucky right now.
And by being familiar, right? It seems like this is a guy who, right, the base of the party knows and trusts. He's vice president for 8 years. And ultimately, when you look at all the other attributes of other people, money for Bloomberg, Warren had the organization, Pete built an organization and had this sort of preternatural ability to communicate. None, right, like Biden sometimes can't get a word out. Biden has been, right, that he's graded on a curve in the debates. And his campaign organization has been really lacking compared to a lot of other people. And yet there he is just crushing everybody. And it's also interesting, too, that this happened so quickly, and voters in a lot of these states so many of them seem to be waiting for exactly something like this to happen. And it seems like they all got the signal, right? I mean, for him to be winning Massachusetts and competitive in potentially winning Maine and to be this close, right? It tells you that a lot of these late deciding voters, maybe they were waiting for someone to figure out, like you said, right? Yeah. Not Bernie, but who? And when everybody else, it's obvious that it's Biden, all that support.
There's almost like it almost feels like to me in looking at this and then thinking back to conversations I had with people over the months before this election day, that there's almost a circuit breaker nature to the Joe Biden candidacy. That there were people who were like, they're looking at other places, but if they fell back, they were going to be okay with Biden. And I'll give you an example in the California legislature. A member of the assembly named Lorena Gonzalez, a Democrat of San Diego, very liberal, pro-union Democrat, always talked about how she has loved Joe Biden and is a big fan of Joe Biden. Who did she endorse? Elizabeth Warren. She is the most vocal Elizabeth Warren supporters. Now, I have not talked to Assemblywoman Gonzalez tonight, but I bet you she will say, I'm good with Joe Biden. He's always been good to me. He's always somebody I can rely on. And I feel like that kind of nature of looking for people but being good with them, you know, maybe that's a reservoir of goodwill. He's got a lot of ways to go, but it's an interesting part to the, you know, the race the way it's played out tonight.
Our colleague Jenny Jarvie down in Alabama today interviewed a 60-year-old woman who drove to the polls. She had been thinking about Sanders. She'd been thinking about Warren. She'd been going back and forth. As she was driving, she heard a advertisement on the radio with her senator, Doug Jones, Democrat from Alabama, talking about how Biden was the strongest candidate to beat Trump. She said she started thinking about it. She said to herself, I just don't think Sanders is going to be able to beat Trump. Warren's not going anywhere. I guess I'm going to vote for Biden. And you know, that's one voter, but you can see that millions and millions of other people went through that same thought process in all 14 of these states tonight in order to produce these kinds of results.
That's a heck of a bumper sticker line, isn't it? I guess I'll vote for Biden. I mean, maybe it works. Maybe it works for him now. Who knows if it'll work in the long run? The Sanders.
So many people probably made that conclusion because, you know, the field winnowed. There were only a couple of choices. And when one seems obviously stronger than the others, getting endorsed by all these other people who were just in the race, who were on these ballots, and it's like, okay, it's everybody over here behind Biden and Bernie. And if you weren't with Bernie at the beginning, you're probably not going to be with Bernie now. It's right. There's a guy who has a ceiling that's basically the same as his floor. He said he can expand the electorate. We haven't seen it. And so, you know, maybe it's a delegate fight going forward. But, yeah, to your point, maybe Joe Biden's ahead of that delegate fight now, which is a stunning result tonight.
And it's an interesting contrast both with Sanders and with Trump. You know, Donald Trump is a person, as you know, who has ardent followers who would, you know, go through fire for him, but also a lot of people who can't stand him. Joe Biden does not have a lot of ardent followers who'd go through fire for him, but on the other hand, there are also not all that many people who say that I just can't stand him. So, you know, it's as you were saying about the Assemblywoman, there are a lot of people who feel, well, okay, I'm okay with him. I may not love him, but I'm okay with
it. The divisions are going to be so interesting, though, from here on out in terms of the Sanders movement, which still is a movement and a powerful movement, and how people react to that and how the top leaders of the Democratic Party react. I was thinking just a moment ago of Governor Gavin Newsom in California, who was close to the Clintons, and of course he was a Harris supporter when she was in. She's out. He's been out this whole time. But Newsom won in part his race as governor with the help of the California Nurses Association, a very staunchly liberal group that is for single-payer health care, Medicare for all, you know where I'm going, and are big backers of Bernie Sanders. The navigation of these political paths by top elected officials between Sanders and the rest of the universe, obviously the Biden universe, it's going to be super interesting to me to watch in the days and weeks moving forward.
I'm gonna wrap this in just a second, but Senator Harris, there was some speculation earlier in the week. You know, Biden was going to Oakland earlier. Today was in Oakland. There was speculation, oh, he's on this endorsement tour. You know, Harris's staff said, no, she's in Washington. There's no endorsement coming. But it seems like the party is really coalescing around Biden, with the exception of the Sanders wing of the party. Do we expect an endorsement from Senator Harris soon? Is that likely, or do you think she'll wait a bit longer?
I don't know. I mean, she's covering her in California, I think, has been different than people who cover her in Washington. She's had an interesting arc of her career. If I was her, I would try to figure out when's the most political, when do I maximize my political boom by doing it? And I would say the same for Governor Newsom. I'd say the same for, well, Senator Feinstein already endorsed, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that a lot of people are going to be watching, and she's another study of how you navigate those different universes of the Democratic
she made that
election.
choice. I'm getting out early. It's not going my way. I'm going to avoid being on the California ballot. And now she's in a position, a lot of people look at her and say, she'd look real good on that ticket next to Joe Biden. So that's another possibility for her, and I guess we'll have to sort of wait and see. We're a little ways from sort of handicapping the Veep stakes, since we're not,
first we got to count all the votes.
Not quite.
We can come back and talk about that another day.
To a nominee. Last thing, Warren, Bloomberg. Any news from them tonight? Do we expect that we may have some press conferences tomorrow?
The Bloomberg people say that they're reassessing overnight. He won American Samoa. $660 million to win American Samoa. He may decide that that's not a great bet. Warren, she has been vowing to stay in. She's scheduled advertising buys and campaign trips going forward, but you could cancel those pretty fast.
Yes, you can, as Mayor Pete did on Sunday night, and
And wouldn't it be interesting if the race shifts again before we get all the votes and delegates sorted out in a state like California, right? Because we won't know until the end of March, early April, with some of these delegates in some of these smaller areas. Wouldn't it be interesting if somebody who backs out goes, oh, wait a minute, I got 42 delegates in California, maybe I'll rethink it.
Well, we know we are looking at a two-person race at this point. That's pretty clear. David, John, thank you for staying up late and for helping us digest and understand some of these results tonight. We'll look forward to it, and I'll see you at the airport in the morning.
Okay.
All right.
Safe travels.
Thank you, guys. All right, we're going to turn now to how voters fared here in Los Angeles today, dealing with LA's new voting machines. And while we are still waiting for the official turnout numbers throughout the state, we do know that the voters were still waiting to cast their ballot at voting centers past 8 p.m. when the polls closed. Samantha Melbourne-Weaver, audience engagement editor at the LA Times, is with us now. Samantha, your team posted some video on Twitter of a poll worker closing the line at Shepherd of the Valley Church in West Hills. Let's take a look at that video and then we'll chat.
You're not in. You come in right now when I get here. You're the last person in line. You're the last person in line. I'm going to take your picture. Okay. Because I got nothing else. I got nothing else. You guys smile for me.
Okay, let's all look at them.
You guys all smile, yeah. Please. Now, here's what. You have to tell the other people that are here. I got them. You have to tell them that it's closed and you're the last person.
Okay.
You got to please do me a favor. Just think of, I got nothing else. I need to get in there and help you guys get out of here.
Yeah.
So I can't come out and be a line monitor. We don't have enough people.
Okay.
Okay? So you're in. Let me take your picture. Okay, and I'm gonna just a couple more people, just kind of, hey, you guys are towards the end, but you're gonna make it. We're gonna have a big party at the end of this.
I'm the very last person. You will be done by midnight?
Well, hopefully.
Well, Sam, that's one way to do it. Any idea what happens if you're in the line, but you haven't cast your ballot? I mean, do we know if those people were able to actually cast ballots tonight?
Yeah, so the line's closed at 8 o'clock, which means no one else can jump in line, but as far as we've seen and as far as we've heard from all of our fabulous followers on Twitter, all those people are still in line waiting to cast their ballots. After that video, which was shot by Sonali Kohli, one of our reporters who was out in the field tonight, we asked our Twitter followers to send us video if they were still waiting in line. We got a bunch of responses. I've got some tweets up here from people who, this woman was just walking her dog in South Pasadena and sent this video of just hundreds and hundreds of people in line. It's really not very different in very many other places. We've seen pictures of people in the Glendale Library waiting to vote, kind of perusing the books and weaving around the stacks as they wait to cast their ballots. We've seen one of the worst cases of a bunch of unused voting machines. At the Hammer Museum, which is in Westwood, at 10 o'clock, there were 219 people left in line waiting to vote. And there were so many people who had been there for so long, we're talking 2 hours, 3 hours, that there was a group of men, and we think college students, who were collecting donations and bringing back pizzas that they had bought and delivering them to people in line. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it is a little crazy, and we see this, over and over on election night. People tend to vote after work, and there tends to be long lines. Good to have books and pizza, but questionable in terms of turnout. Do we have any anecdotal information, anything else from folks out there who are in these lines about whether or not the long wait times were more just the result of getting there at rush hour, or potentially, as you mentioned, machines not being used or machines not working as they were supposed to? I know this was sort of the first time out on the track for a lot of these machines.
Yeah, we didn't hear that machines were broken. We did hear that either there weren't enough poll workers to check people in, or that some of the technology used to check voters into their polling centers was glitching. So a lot of these poll workers were using iPads that either weren't connecting to the internet or ran out of battery. So really the bottlenecks were in getting people into the building, not so much with the voting machines.
And any other good tweets, good anecdotes, anything else from people who are out there in terms of, the conversation and whether people are excited about this primary, anything else that is worth sharing that our folks would be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, two quick things. People really formed communities out there. There was a woman who reported that every time someone left with a voting sticker, the rest of the voters still waiting in line would erupt into cheers and clap for them and high-five them on their way out, which is pretty cool to see. And it seems like even though we were among the media outlets to report that Bernie Sanders had won the California primary for the Democratic presidential nomination, people were still waiting in line. No one left. They were really interested in a lot of the other races and ballot measures that were up for a vote tonight.
Yeah, it's good to see folks engaged, and that sticker is always sort of a draw. Even though I noticed today a lot of folks wearing it, it's a bigger sticker than it used to be, so maybe that's also an incentive. Although some people I heard were there so long they were given 2 or 3, which is, not...
They earned it.
Yeah, they did earn it, yeah. I think you'd probably rather have the time, but stickers you only get once a year. So Samantha Melbourne-Weaver, our audience engagement editor up in our newsroom, thanks for staying up late, and thanks for sharing some of that with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eli.
Yep. And we will be right back in 90 seconds. Stay with us.
The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
And I think we should put a proven winner in charge.
If I'm elected and I'm coming for you and gun manufacturers, I'm going to take you on. And I'm going to that.
People want a chance to hear women have an opportunity to speak.
If I'm president of the United States, you're not going to interfere in any more. What a wonderful country we have. The best-known socialist in the country happens to be a millionaire with 3 houses.
And here's the deal. We ought to start rewarding work, not just wealth.
I like that open, so we played it again for you. 10:45 here on Super Tuesday night in Los Angeles. Welcome back. And back with me on the set, LA Times sports and culture columnist Elsie Granderson. Good to see you.
You as well.
Thanks for coming back.
You look good. You're doing a great job.
They keep putting powder on my face every 50. When we show a promo and then they come back and yeah, it's like my corner guy comes in and ice water on the face. We've talked a lot about the race, and I think there's some surprise. Not that Bernie won California, but that he didn't win it by a larger margin, it looks like. Are you surprised at how quickly Joe Biden has closed on him and may wind up tonight with a delegate lead on Bernie Sanders, given some, that he's just done better than a lot of people, I think, anticipated going in, even if they knew it was going to be a good night for him, didn't know it was going to be this good. Where do you think that leaves us?
I think it leaves us doing what we always do. And when I say us, I just mean sort of like the nation, the media, political pundits, etc. Every 4 years we go through this process. Iowa and New Hampshire happens. We proclaim a front runner before the backbone of the Democratic Party has an opportunity to participate and vote, and that's being the African-American voters, particularly the voters of the South, particularly the older voters. We all know who helps make the president when it comes to Democrat voters, and yet every 4 years we go through this. So no, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because we knew Joe Biden had a lot of support from African-American voters, and they hadn't had an opportunity to have their say yet. Now they've had their say, now we have an election.
Yeah, and now it seems like it's pretty clear who the choice is. I mean, there were a lot of pieces written about, why we're doing Iowa and why we're doing New Hampshire and why is the calendar this way, and, it's not reflective of the party as a whole. But there's still all these other pieces that get written about, who's going to win Iowa, and it's going to launch them. And Joe Biden, why aren't you winning Iowa? They had a theory of the case. It's worked for them. They waited. You get to states that are more diverse, more reflective of the party as a whole. Joe Biden's run away with those states. Do you think that's mainly because people just sort of know him and trust him? I mean, it seems like it's not a superior campaign organization. It's not superior performances and debates, but it's a guy that people know. It's a guy who was Obama's vice president for 8 years. I mean, how much do you think familiarity is what ultimately, when those voters in South Carolina went to the polls, Biden came in, the best he'd done was second place in Nevada a week before. And he won more than half roughly 50% of the vote in South Carolina. Do you think there's just a trust factor there?
Well, that's part of it. A lot of the generational gap, if you will, between the Bernie supporters and the Biden supporters or the moderate supporters, it's a real thing that the Democrats have to figure out how to bridge if they want to go ahead and win in the general election, because they don't seem to have a lot in common right now. Biden represents pragmatism. He represents the answer to the question that a lot of people are asking: who can beat Donald Trump? Biden does not represent what Bernie represents. His pressing thing isn't who can beat Donald Trump. His pressing thing is we need to correct things aggressively because minimum wage is needed to increase. We want health care. We want this. So he's very policy driven, whereas a vote for Biden is a vote for defeating Donald Trump. I mean, if you were to go, and I've done my own reporting on this, including today, just standing in line, if you ask someone specific Biden policies, they stumble. But if you ask a Bernie supporter about policies, they can go on and on and on and on. That's a big difference. However, when you get to the general election, are these two groups going to come together, or are they going to stand as separate camps? And that really depends upon who Biden selects as his VP and how Biden, if Bernie doesn't get in, how does he handle not being the nominee again?
Second time.
A second time.
You've got the president out there pushing on that sore spot all the time and saying, oh, Bernie's getting hosed again.
How does he handle that again? Does he handle it more graciously than some people thought that he handled with Hillary Clinton? That's the big question.
Yeah, and he has said, look, Trump should worry about himself, run the country, deal with coronavirus. Don't worry about us, we'll be fine. But he has not exactly sent strong signals to his voters that, look, at the end of the day, my people need to support the nominee. He's been in a strong position where he's looked like he might be that nominee to a point, and still may be, right? He's still in a pretty strong
absolutely.
position.
This is still early.
And I guess, if Biden had fallen apart and Bloomberg was the alternative, it's really hard to see Bernie people, right? The guy who rails against millionaires and billionaires are now just billionaires. But it's hard to see how those people could come home to supporting Mike Bloomberg as the Democratic nominee. It's less of a distance to get to Joe Biden, but it's still maybe not easy, right? I mean, this is going to be, if this is a tight fight into the convention, this is going to be challenging for
You're absolutely correct. I mean, I remember being in Cleveland for the RNC.
Me too.
And so you know how awkward it was for Ted Cruz to come up on stage and try to give his blessings to eventual President Donald Trump. and the energy in that space, in the queue, as they call the arena.
Right.
You remember how awkward it was, and I don't know about your feelings, but I didn't feel as if he gave him a ringing endorsement at all.
No, it was it was like reality TV. It was kind of it was a diss.
Exactly.
Yeah, vote your conscience was what he said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you think about what may occur, with the Democrats on this side, you have a leader who has felt the first time around it was stolen from him, and if it becomes a broker convention and he doesn't get through it, he definitely is going to feel like it's been stolen, and his supporters are going to feel like it's been stolen. How does he handle that? That's the real question. So, I mean, the Democrats, while this is a good night for Biden, there are more questions for the party as a whole because they have to figure out how to get these two parties to coexist.
And, the scrutiny for Joe Biden, if Joe Biden becomes sort of the likeliest nominee at this point, or there's a groundswell of, there's more coverage of him, right? I mean, like, he's the vice president. He was kind of a front runner for a long time, but he wasn't doing that great. He wasn't winning. And so now that it's basically down to him and Bernie, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny. Do you worry about whether Biden can hold up under that kind of press scrutiny, under renewed attacks from Trump and his allies about Hunter Biden and Ukraine? Because Joe Biden has looked, if you're to the naked eye, you're just watching the last couple nights, he's looked like a juggernaut, right? But he has not looked that way through much of this campaign.
He's not a very good campaigner, right? He's not a very good debater. But people identify with his empathy. They identify with his story. They identify with what he represents. So even though he's not as polished as a politician as perhaps we're accustomed to seeing someone who's been a vice president, I think that he does benefit from the fact that there's something very tangible about who he is as a person and as a man. Now, to your point about whether or not that's going to be able to help him in terms of debating Donald Trump on the stage if he were to secure the nomination, I think you have two very similar characters who tend to say things without actually running through a filter. Mm-hmm. And the question is, whose remarks can you stomach? Whose stumbles can you handle? Whose gaffes are going to be debilitating versus easily forgiven? And on top of that, is there really going to be any substantive policy conversations that's going to happen at all when they do end up on a debate stage, or will it get boiled down to who has the best zingers?
Well, and even, we're talking about debates, but I think back to 2016, I went to these debates and I remember the theater of them. I remember when Trump trotted out Bill Clinton's accusers on the stage in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. They were sitting in the audience. Ultimately, I don't know if any of it mattered, right? I mean, Trump, I think if you're scoring it like a fight, Trump lost all three debates to Hillary Clinton. If you're scoring on, substance but ultimately, like, either he was being graded on a curve or it just didn't matter at the end of the day because here's a character from TV people think they know, mm-hmm. And a person, Hillary Clinton, who's been in the public light for 30 years. I think people had opinions maybe formed of a lot of them. This is similar in some sense in that Biden is not a newcomer. Right. And Trump is obviously, right, saturates every element of our culture. It will be interesting to sort of say, I don't even know if it's debates. I think your point is smart that, we may not have a campaign that is much about policy.
No, if Bernie was on stage, it would be policy driven because that's what supporters have become accustomed to. And that's how he's always handled being in the public eye, sticking to the issues and not getting personal with people. Though he's gotten a little bit more personal this go round than the first go round. Your point about the 2016 general election and the three debates, I think to the naked eye, if you're being objective, Clinton appeared to have won all three. But what she couldn't get past was this already preconceived notion about who she was and what she represented. And Biden's going to have a whole 8 years worth of being vice president to answer for, in addition to his work before becoming vice president. So he's got to be well studied to handle any sort of attacks that comes in terms of, well, what about this and what about that, and you did this and you did that, and the administration did this. He's going to have to be well versed to have good answers for those questions for people to feel better about voting for him. But one thing that I do know that we can anticipate from both men, if they were to enter stage together, is that there's going to be a lot of awkward moments and a lot of gaffes. I mean, like a lot. And we're going to have to decide as a voting public whether or not those are substantial enough to deter us from supporting one candidate versus another.
Are you ready for, we can leave it there. we can go down that road of hypotheticals, but
SNL
we're
is gonna be
still
fantastic, put it this
but
way.
we are still a long way away from having an
yes,
actual
we are.
nominee. So we'll just keep watching and keep reporting and see what happens, and keep relying on on you for our for commentary in the paper, cultural commentary. We'll see where things go, and look forward to your perspective, because it's an intelligent one, it's a smart one, it's one we're glad to have in the paper. So
thanks. I do.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate everybody sticking with us, and I've enjoyed the discussion with all of our reporters and folks who have been part of it. We have reached the end of our 3-hour live stream here from the first floor of the LA Times headquarters in El Segundo. Thank you to all of you for joining us, for sticking with us through this live stream, The Pulse of a Nation, California Decides. And thanks to all the folks here at the Times who were part of pulling this thing off. Great work to all of you. I'm Eli Stokols, and for the Los Angeles Times, good night.
And I think we should put a proven winner in charge of
If I'm elected and I'm coming for you, and gun manufacturers, I'm going to take you on. And I'm going to say that
People want a chance to hear women have an opportunity to speak.
If I'm president of the United States, you're not going to interfere in any more. What a wonderful country we have. The best-known socialist in the country happens to be a millionaire with 3 houses.
And here's the deal. We ought to start rewarding work, not just wealth.